He would have called it a river of memory rather than water, a slow, pale ribbon moving beneath a sky that was still learning how to be morning. And along its banks people woke to the soft clink of pots, the whisper of woven grass mats being lifted from dew, the hush of cattle turning in their sleep. Somewhere a child laughed and then hushed itself, as if the dawn were a guest who preferred quiet. In that liminal hour, the wind came like a careful hand over the reeds, and the first smoke of the day rose from a small neat fire. They believed the river had a name older than their own names, a name that sounded like seashells and breath, Saraswati. It sang beneath the earth as much as above it, so the elders said, and it kept the shape of the earliest hymns. He knew these stories the way one knows the pulse in a wrist, steady, warm, and close. The rishis, the seers, sat near the fire with eyes that seemed to look inward and outward at once. Their hair bore the night's coolness, their voices a low murmur that almost matched the river's reply. When they spoke to Agni, the flame listened. When they spoke to the dawn, the light blushed, spreading like saffron in watered milk. Some named Indra, breaker of enclosures, rider of thunder. Some tasted the syllable of Surya, the sun who unrolls the dark, as if it were a bolt of cloth. Words were not just words, they were seeds thrown into a listening sky, and if tended with breath and rhythm, they sprouted into guidance, shelter, rain. He noticed how the fire altered everything it touched. The faces, the clay, the bronze bowl that slept in embers until it sang. Even the smoke seemed to carry messages to unseen courtyards where the gods leaned close. Long ago, someone began counting beats with a string of knotted fibre, one breath, two breaths, a rising cadence, a falling, until the hymn found its own feet and walked. They said a true verse could do more than please the ear. It could set a chariot's wheel true, calm a skittish bull, ask the river to remember its source when the summer burned too fiercely. Later, scholars would disagree. Was the river here or there, or two rivers wearing one name? Did the singers arrive on swift-hoofed stories or stand up from the soil like grass? Yet even their quiet debates felt like tributaries that did not disturb the main flow. The hymn kept going, gentle, definite, and old. Beside the water, women rinsed grain and spoke of small omens, a heron circling twice, a ring of light around the moon. Men checked the yokes on humble carts, touched the wood as if greeting an old friend. Children lifted their faces to the starting sun as if to drink from it. A conch far away called the morning to attention. He could smell ghee warming, the lucid scent of vacha root, the green breath of crushed leaves. The world was a small altar, and everything placed upon it found a kind of grace. He watched a rishi trace a shape in ash, a simple square for the hearth, a mouth for the sacrifice, a silent geometry that linked this patch of earth to the far geometry of stars. When the chant began, it moved like oars, dipping, lifting, dipping. No rush, no strain, only a steady crossing from speech to meaning. Someone passed a cup that tasted of mountain secrets. They called it soma, though what it truly was no one could pin with a single thorn of certainty. He took only a sip and felt the edges of things soften, then clarify, the way a mirror fogs and then clears to show a truer face. He thought of cattle bells, of hoofprints pooled with last night's rain, of how the river sometimes disappeared beneath sand and then returned, like a story that had taken a breath. In the tilt of light, the beads at a girl's wrist made a small constellation, and he wondered if the sky learned its stars by first attending bracelets, anklets, droplets on a spider thread. The elders spoke of RTA, the fittedness of things, a seam that held the day and night together without effort. Perhaps that was why the hymn needed no hurry. It trusted that what should arrive would arrive, like the boat that glides into view only when the river curve is ready to let it be seen. A chariot stood at the edge of camp, wheel rims catching dawn. No one was racing anywhere, but it comforted them to see its readiness, the way the body rests, but the heart keeps time. He remembered a line from an older singer, how the fire is born in wood, and yet must be coaxed, how the sun sleeps under the horizon, and yet rises exactly when the bird's second note is due. The hymn was full of such little paradoxes that made sense to the breath, if not to the measuring stick. A dog barked once and then thought better of it. Even the animals seemed to respect the first fires. Smoke wrote brief black letters on the gold paper of the sky, and the letters unknotted into nothing, yet he felt he had read them. The river offered its quiet applause, bank to bank. If a stranger had wandered there, they would have seen little spectacle, no glittering palace, no jewelled throne, only a hand feeding a flame, a voice feeding a verse, a pot feeding a family. And yet, under such plainness, something intricate and enduring was being braided. Law and story, measure and mercy, the memory of how to be human together when mornings are new and maps unmade. He sensed the day would ask for labour, fields to tend, trackways to repair. But the hymn made the work lighter, the way a shoulder accepts a yoke when it recognises the yoke's smooth grain. By the time the sun lifted cleanly, the words had nested in the rafters of his chest. He felt both larger and more exact, like a loom freshly tightened, ready to draw a pattern from what the river kept saying under its breath. The fire was banked, but not extinguished. A single coal held the promise of evening. He knew that as night returned, other fires would wake and answer this one, each hearth a star, each star an eye that watched the world kindly. Between them, the hymns would travel, slow and sure, teaching the tongue to move as gently as water over stone. And in that patient exchange, river to flame, breath to word, ear to silence, the next practice would gather itself, waiting for a more deliberate light, a geometry of offering, a home built in heat and ash and care. Somewhere in the quiet room of the day to come, a new altar was already imagining its own glow. By noon, the hearth had learned the shape of his hands, and the square he drew in ash had deepened into a little cosmos. 4 edges to remember the directions, a quiet centre for the breath of the world, while the fire, patient and bright, listened to ladles of ghee, the way an old teacher listens to the first notes of a student. Each pour a syllable, each crackle a reply. They called it offering, but it felt more like conversation. The tongues of flame spoke in a language of bending and lifting, and the grains, barley, rice, answered by opening their fragrance into the air, a small surrender that somehow made everything larger. Women traced rangoli at the thresholds, powders of chalk and petal arranged in spirals that had no beginning and no end. The designs were not merely pretty, he sensed, but reminders that order could be woven from dust if one's hand moved with care. In the shade, a boy practiced the names of rivers the way other boys tried the weights of stones. He wanted to be able to say them without hurry, as if the syllables themselves were a kind of bridge. Someone brought a new cord for the sacrificial post, its fibres still smelling of rain. Across the camp, the cattle's slow breath kept time. Beyond them, the river dozed and woke by turns, as if the water were remembering a dream it did not wish to lose. There were rules and there was tenderness, and they did not quarrel. The RTA that the elders whispered about did not arrive as a command. It emerged like the rightness of a pot balanced on the head, or the calm that spreads when the loom's threads run true. He watched as the geometry of fire, its mouth, its patient square, taught people how to stand together without jostling, how to pass the ladle so the hand did not sting, how to keep the coal alive while the wind reconsidered itself. The chant lifted again, deeper now, oars in a wider river. The verses had learned the morning's light and were testing their strength in the noon. There were doubts too, as honest as bare feet. Was Soma a plant, a star drink, a discipline of breath? Why did the river sometimes vanish into the sand and return miles away, as if nothing had happened? The elders answered with stories, not verdicts, and their stories left space where a young mind could pitch its tent. Out on the horizon, a line of dust was rising. Travellers, perhaps, or a herd choosing another meadow, and the sun slid a dull coin across the sky. He tasted ash at the edge of his tongue and did not mind. It felt like being written upon by a letter the day was sending to night. Later, when the heat softened, they built another hearth. Stones were chosen for their quiet, not their size. A shy one went at the corner, a warm one at the south. He realized there was a craft beneath the craft, a care for how things addressed one another, wood to flame, grain to breath, hand to hand. In that care, law was being born without anyone naming it. How to ask, how to refuse, how to share what was scarce without making the air heavy. Children braided grasses into little belts and crowned a clay figure with marigold. A dog lay nearby, tail thumping, when the chant dipped into a friendlier note. And in the gentle seam between sound and silence, something else inclined itself toward the fire. A thought about mercy, about the power of not striking when one could, about how strength might be more beautiful when it chooses not to be loud. He could not have called it Dharma yet. He only felt the way the skin on his forearms cooled and warmed with the breeze, the way the heart settles when it recognizes a good path in the dust. As evening came, he sensed the day had rounded a corner. The first star arrived, like a bead, slipped onto a thread that had been waiting all along. Voices lowered, lamps were lit. The river took back the colour it had loaned to the sky. In the soft hour, he imagined a road beyond their clearing, a road that would grow confident enough to stitch towns together, then kingdoms, then stories on stone that would not burn or fade. Some future hand would shape rock into a promise and set it upright where birds could rest. Compassion, he thought, without the word, might one day learn to live in granite, so that a traveller who could not read the hymn would still feel its kindness under his palm. If you, listening now in your own quiet room, find your breath moving more slowly with this fire, tell me where you are and what time your night begins. And if this gentle path feels like one you'd like to follow across many evenings, you are welcome to subscribe to the entire history, so our small lamp can meet you again when the world grows hushed. The last offerings hissed softly. The coals collected themselves into a secret, dull and red. Someone drew a circle around the hearth with a wetted finger. Someone else folded the ladle in cloth, the way a mother folds a sleeper into a blanket. The square returned to ash, yet the ash was wiser now, as if it had learned to keep a memory without heat. Crickets began their careful spelling. A heron stitched the dusk with its slow wings. He thought of the river again, that modest archivist, storing and releasing, losing and finding, teaching people how not to panic when a thing disappears from sight. Perhaps tomorrow they would move, or perhaps they would wake to a pillar of smoke that was only cloud. Either way, the verses had entered their limbs, and the geometry of the day would hold. Far away beyond the last tamarind, a stone dreamed of being carved, of bearing a message that would teach strength to bow its head, an uncut promise lifting its face toward the coming moon. The road he imagined became real in the long hush between centuries, stitched by feet and hooves and the low song of wheels. It ran past groves of banyan where merchants tied their dreams for shade, past ferries that crossed rivers with the patience of old boatmen, past villages that smelled of sesame and smoke. And then one day the road lifted its gaze to meet a column of stone rising from the plain like an exhalation that forgot to fall back to earth. It was taller than any story he had heard, and smoother than a river-worn pebble, its skin polished until the sun could check its face there. At the top, 4 lions watched the 4 directions with a quiet that did not need to prove itself. People gathered in the circle of its shadow without being asked. Some rested pack frames against their calves. Some pressed their fingers to the stone, as if hoping to hear a pulse. A child craned to see the animals, and imagined they would purr, if stroking could reach that high. Carved along the shaft were words in a script that looked like sprouting seeds, neither boast nor battle call, but counsel, deliberate and humane. He learned to sound a few of them as a teacher once sounded the first hymn, slowly, with breath. They told of care as if it were governance, of kindness as if it were strongest of all measures. They spoke to governors and shepherds in one breath. They asked for gentleness to animals, for shade trees along the roads, for wells that knew no price and no tribe. The stone, it seemed, had learned what the fire had been trying to say, and it wanted to say it to everyone at once. No one there named the wound that had taught the lesson, the bitter field by the sea where chariots bogged with sorrow, and the king woke to grief. But the stone remembered without accusing. Some would say the turn in his heart arrived all at once, a thunderclap of remorse. Others would say it had been gathering grain by grain, a servant treated as kin here, a prisoner released there, an early morning, when the distant cries of battle sounded too much like cattle separated from their calves. Either way, the column held the afterlight of that turning, and in its shade a different law practiced its steps, one that measured victory not by the number of cities in chains, but by the number of hearts that breathed more easily by dusk. He traced the letters with his eye and felt how authority could become listening, how a kingdom could lengthen its life by lowering its voice. Across the plain, other pillars answered, some with bell-shaped bases like flowers too heavy with meaning to lift their heads, some with animals both gentle and alert, all with the same quiet insistence that the best way for power to be large was for it to be kind. There was talk of couriers who travelled like monsoon birds from post to post, of healers carrying herbs for both man and beast, of a calendar that promised days, for reflection the way a farmer promises fallow to a good field. Scholars now argue over which edict stood where, whether this curve of script began in one capital or another, whether the lions once looked brighter with paint. Such debates are the river's eddies, earnest and circling, but the current is plain. The stone is teaching. On a late afternoon, when the light had thinned to a warm tea, he watched a caravan arrive, dusty and listening. A woman with indigo-stained fingertips stood with her jars and read the opening lines aloud to her son. A monk with a robe the colour of fallen leaves touched his forehead to the column and smiled in the small private way of a man who recognises his path named in another tongue. A shepherd, who could not read a letter, leaned his back against the pillar and felt what he later called a good weight, as if the earth had put its arm around his shoulders. The lions did not move, and yet the four directions felt tended. Far down the road, a line of young barnyans waited behind fences woven of reeds, ready to be carried to new mile marks. The thought that a traveller, yet unborn, would one day pass under their generosity made something in his chest unclench. If you, listening now in your room, perhaps by a window, perhaps with your own lamp soft beside you, feel this tenderness gathering like a small rain, tell me where you are and what time your night has come. And if you wish to walk these quiet roads with us again, consider subscribing to the entire history so our voices can find you gently across the dark. Evening approached, and the pillar lengthened across the ground until its shadow reached the prayer mark on a potter's hand. A jackal called, and then, reconsidering the wisdom of his own voice, went silent. He imagined other signs being raised, cave walls smoothed and filled with counsel, copper plates that carried promises from one bank of a river to the next, and he felt the same seam of rightness, Artier's humble cousin, running through them. Mercy had become legible, and yet the road did not end in stone. It curved on, learning to trust minds as well as hearts, learning to gather questions as well as answers. Somewhere ahead, lamps would be lifted, not to worship alone, but to study, to search the inner fire of thought the way the first hearth searched the patient shape of offering. He pictured a long, low complex of rooms where wind moved like a librarian and the night walked softly so as not to disturb the syllables, a place where grammar itself would be a kind of music and logic, a calm river with many fords. The column behind him hummed in the dusk like a tuning fork laid gently on the world. He stepped out of its shadow with reluctance, carrying the thought that law could be a lamp and compassion a road. Far off, beyond the sleeping fields, the faintest halo of lamplight gathered, as if an entire city of learning were about to breathe in, hold, and then exhale its welcome into the night. Night came to the low red brick world like a reader closing a palm over a page, and the first lamps of the great monastery opened their small suns, one by the gate where travellers shrugged off the road's weight, one along a cloister where sandals rested like punctuation, one in a cell where a novice traced letters on a palm leaf until the curves became muscle memory and breath. The wind moved through Nalanda with the hush of a librarian, turning leaves without ever being seen. He had heard of this place long before he arrived, the way a river hears of the sea it has not yet met. The word Nalanda travelled on the trade routes like a kindly rumour, passed from ferryman to grain seller, from monk to weaver, until it felt less like a location and more like a weather that minds could enter. Tonight its weather was cool ink and warm light. He stood in a courtyard where brick remembered the day's heat, and around him rose long, patient buildings, viharas with cells that held both sleep and study, shrines where the quiet had learned to speak in stone, libraries where knowledge was stacked like harvests awaiting winter. In one hall, a teacher's voice glowed. It did not command so much as invite, lighting wick from wick. Questions walked beside answers without hurrying them. Grammar, Panini's austere, beautiful lattice, became a soft instrument in these mouths, changing from rule to rhythm. Logic unrolled like a mat, so any traveller could sit without embarrassment and attempt the crossing. The old motifs returned to greet him, fire carefully tended, words offered like grain, a geometry of care. Arta lived here too, not in sacrifice but in arrangement, the way shelves face the dawn so that light would start its day among the pages, the way water channels kept a murmur just loud enough to keep minds from tightening. the way paths met and parted with the politeness of rivers. He learned that the place was less a single university than a city of learning. The hum of debate in one corner, the slow stitching of commentary in another, the silence of meditation like cloth stretched clean between them so nothing snagged. Monks in russet robes passed like moving bricks. Lay scholars in cotton white paused under fig trees spotted with moonlight. A physician with a bag of herbs compared notes with a grammarian, and to everyone's surprise, they discovered they were speaking about the same thing, how to realign what has slipped, whether in bone or sentence. In a scriptorium, 3 lamps kept watch over names that had learned to travel beyond their bodies: Nagarjuna, Asanga, Vasubandhu. Each syllable a small oar, each text a boat across the river of not knowing, a murmur at his back. Some would later argue over how many monasteries stood here, how many students, whether the libraries were 3, Ratnasagara, Ratnadadi, Ratnaranjaka, or another number entirely, whether the final night of ruin came like a storm, or like a drought that only seemed swift because no one was measuring closely. Debates circled the facts like fireflies, but the felt truth in this hour was simpler. Minds were meeting, and the meeting made a light that wished to be kind. He watched a novice wrestle with a paradox: how emptiness could be full, how a self could be a useful fiction. And the teacher, smiling without display, let the question remain half-answered, the way a moon remains half-veiled to dignify the sky. Around them, the breeze turned the pages with immaculate courtesy. A bell sounded and did not hurry anyone. It merely touched the hour and released it. He wandered the cloister and felt how the place gathered the world without grasping at it. There was a room where foreign tongues braided into the local speech, faint accents of Silk Road and Spice Coast, and steps that had learned to keep time with ships. A student from the northern valleys brought a map in his memory more detailed than any drawn line. A visitor from the peninsula smelled of salt and pepper, literal pepper, and told of monsoon winds that behaved like teachers arriving at the same hour every year. In the refectory, the clink of bowls was a kind of honest music. In the courtyard, shadows pooled like water in the joints of brickwork, old enough to trust. He stopped where a channel carried rainwater to a lotus tank, and the moon leaned down to count itself among the leaves. It struck him that the fire of the first hymns had taken new shape here, not in flame, but in attention. The square of the altar had become the slow square of a page. The offering was the grain of time given to a thought until it flowered into clarity. And because attention is a road, the road beyond Nalanda's walls began to glow in his mind, the road that would carry these teachings to far monasteries and markets, to ships that executed their turns by the compass of seasonal winds, to artisans who would carve knowledge into stone so it could weather monsoons without losing its kindness. If you are listening now, in your own harbour of night, tell me where that harbour lies, and what hour your tide has brought you to. If this lamplight feels like good company for your evenings, you're welcome to subscribe to the entire history, so this quiet circle of learning can find you again, wherever the wind carries your days. Near midnight, a librarian closed a palm leaf bundle with a thread, and the simple ceremony of breath. A cook banked the last coal with the respect one shows a teacher resting between classes. Far down a corridor, footsteps slowed, as if their owner had remembered to carry the silence lightly. He sat at the edge of a low platform and listened for what came next. The river that had hummed under the Vedic fires seemed to pass beneath this brick too, unchanged in its patience. The stone pillar that had taught compassion as policy stood somewhere to the west, still ceding shade along a road he had not forgotten. The motifs spoke to one another across time, like friends exchanging letters without needing to sign their names. And somewhere, he could almost taste it. Another chapter was arranging itself in salt air and moon-drawn tides where learning and law would travel on wooden ribs and stitched cloth, and a dynasty would learn to read the monsoon the way a monk reads a text, slowly, faithfully, with trust in the seasons turning. In the last hour before dawn, the lamps lowered their gaze, and the wind gathered itself for a long journey east. Over distant water, somewhere beyond the mangroves, a mast dreamed of waking, and a harbour listened for the first sure footfall of the sea. Dawn reached the coast as if it had been reading all night, and now closed the book with a fingertip, and the long ribs of ships woke under their stitched skins, smelling of resin and salt. He stood where the river finally married the sea, and felt the same old motifs return in different clothing. The hearth had become a galley fire. The square of the altar had become the measured lattice of sails. The pillar's counsel had become painted marks along a quay that told travellers where water was kind. The monsoon, that patient teacher, kept its appointment the way a bell keeps time. From the southwest it arrived like a low hymn, steady and persuasive, filling cloth with purpose and turning harbours into choruses. Men with hands the colour of teak moved with practised grace along gangplanks. Women knotted charms of turmeric and shell to the prow. A boy pressed his ear to the hull and swore he could hear a far market already speaking. Pepper piled like storm clouds, cinnamon sticks like rolled maps, cotton that remembered river wind even after the loom. Under banners that named kings and guilds, the ships gathered their small cities. Weavers' bundles, potters' jars, the hum of accountants' tablets, the laughter of cooks lifting lids to let steam gossip with the morning air. Inscription stones back inland would one day speak of these sea roads, their guilds with names like old trees, their shrines for travellers who prayed for a fair wind and returned to gild the mast with gratitude. But here and now it was only a shore, learning how to breathe like a chest before a long swim. He traced the geometry of a vessel with his eye, its planks locked by pegs and faith, and thought of RTA again, the fittedness that keeps Cosmos and Cartwheel alike from wobbling. The captain, eyes salted by weather and memory, watched the sky the way a scholar reads a verse, for rhythm, for hints, for the pause that means now. Beside him stood a navigator with a bowl of water and a needle that knew where north lived, a quiet magic learned from patient observation and from other coasts whose tongues had already braided into the speech of the port. From this tide line, roads unrolled in water the way the old road had unrolled in dust, toward islands thick with clove scent, toward river mouths where other kingdoms kept their own fires and their own laws, toward harbours that shaped their cities as thoughtfully as a scribe shapes a sentence. He had heard of expeditions that moved not like storms but like long breaths, of embassies carried in the hold beside rice and bronze lamps, of letters pressed into copper that travelled farther than a man's stride. Scholars would later weigh which year a fleet addressed a distant island king, how many hulls cut the same path, whether victory or warning or merely presence had been the aim, but the sea told the story more gently. Ships went and ships returned, and between those two verbs, a world learned how to recognise itself across distances. By noon, the harbour had become a tapestry of tasks. A priest traced a small circle of ash near the prow and lit a lamp that refused to flutter. An old woman sold amulets woven from river grass, the same pattern her grandmother had used inland under different stars. A guild elder counted not only coins but obligations. the wells to be dug at a village upriver, in thanks for pepper grown here, the shrine to be repaired halfway along a coastal road where travellers like to stop and rest their shadows. Farther down the quay, a carver worked a plank with a chisel that seemed to breathe with him, coaxing from the wood a guardian, not fierce, but attentive, the kind of watchfulness that makes sleep deeper. It struck him that compassion had learned to sail. The pillars' lines fixed in stone had become a way of travelling, of seeing 4 directions at once from a moving deck, of treating the port not as a mouth to be emptied, but as a throat to be soothed with fresh water and fair trade. He walked past storage jars, marked with letters he did not fully know, and felt the old Nalanda wind move through his thoughts, reminding him that learning wears many robes. Here, knowledge of knots and currents; there, of treaties and tact; elsewhere, of how to listen when a stranger names his God, and you hear, beneath the name, a familiar silence looking back. When evening lowered its shoulder against the heat, the monsoon's voice deepened to a comforting drone, and sails furled like careful wings as crews ate from brass plates that reflected both lamp and face. He sat on a coil of rope and watched a young sailor hold a conch to the horizon, not to sound it, but to borrow its listening. The sea had a mood tonight, not restless, not stern, but attentive, like a teacher who wants a student to find the line himself. In the half-light, a drummer tested a beat, meant to braid many footsteps into one intention, and somewhere a scribe unrolled a palm leaf to copy the day's agreements before the salt could blur them. If you are listening now by your own window, perhaps with rain rehearsing on the sill, tell me which shore keeps you and what time your night has arrived. And if these soft voyages feel like good company, you may subscribe to the entire history, so this gentle harbour will know to light a lamp for you when the wind returns. Across the water, a smudge of temple shoulder rose against the sky. Stone that had learned to be mountain and hymns at once, its tower shaped like a stitch that sews earth to star. He felt the road turning inland through fields that knew the tide by the way their grasses bent toward a city where masters of stone thought with plumb lines and sang with chisels, where a sanctum would collect darkness the way a jar collects coolness, where ritual would be measured not only in minutes but in light falling across carved stories that never tired of being remembered. The ship bells quieted, the harbour breathed, the lamp at the prow held its small sun steady. Somewhere in the city's heart, a quarry dreamed of becoming cosmos, and a block of granite listened for the first touch that would tell it what kind of sky it was meant to hold. The city of stone woke before the people did, or so it seemed. A faint coolness gathered in the temple's inner court, as if the granite had learned to drink the night and now exhaled it gently. And along the eastern wall, the first line of light laid a measuring thread the builders had trusted for generations. He paused beneath the gopuram, where sculpted guardians stretched like mountains remembering their first rise. Bells made of bronze and patience dozed above his head, and a priest, barefoot and unhurried, moved with a broom of leaves that made a sound like rain kept on a short leash. The plan of the place had been drawn from a quiet mathematics. Vastu's square that is also a seed, a mandala whose cells remember directions and breaths, and the polite distances that let things live together. And as he stepped from threshold to court to cloister to sanctum, he felt how the world could become a home by the care of proportion alone. The outer prakara taught him to walk slowly, to let his shadow lengthen and shorten without complaint. The next ring offered carved stories whose stone pages turned under his gaze, even if his feet stayed still. Deeper in, the air cooled, as if descending into a well, and the sanctum waited like a heart behind ribs, small and intense. Here, In the garbhagriha, the womb room, the square had folded itself into intimacy. Flame had learned to be a dot. The bell sound had learned to be a thread that tied breath to breath. He remembered the first hearth by the old river, the geometry in ash. The way offering made conversation with fire. He remembered the pillar that learned to speak kindness into law. He remembered the brick libraries where attention kept a private lamp. All of it seemed to have met here and taken new shape. Cosmos disguised as building, discipline disguised as beauty, mercy disguised as weight. He watched dawn push its gold through a lattice and come to rest on a bronze that knew how to dance without moving. Nataraja, the lord of dance, ringed by flame, that looked like seconds learning to trust their order. One foot lifted, as if to press down on forgetfulness, one hand open, as if to say, do not fear. 2. The bronze did not look made so much as remembered. It held the carbon scent of chisel and melted wax, but also a composure that suggested the shape had been living in the air all along, waiting for a patient hand to invite it home. Scholars will always file gently around such images with folders of questions. Was this line of curve born here or there? Which century first learned to pour the molten world into a form that could teach without scolding? How did the dancer's ring carry the mathematics of cycles without frightening the heart? And their circling is honest work. Yet in this hour the image spoke more simply. Everything moves, and the movement is kind, if we learn the steps. Outside, the temple skin told other stories. Rows of musicians with stone fingers poised forever on the edge of a note. Horses that never tire. Elephants that remember rivers no one now can name. Kings small beneath the architecture that crowned them. And between the figures, 1,000 vacancies where wind could write a fleeting commentary and go. Above it all, the tower lifted like a stitched prayer, every tear holding the next, as if holding its breath, and at the summit, a finial took the sun and refused to keep it, sending it down again as a blessing spread thin. Around him, time braided itself into a rhythm that had very little to do with hours. Pilgrims arrived with the weariness of road dust in their ankles and left with a careful freshness, nothing dramatic, only the way a cloth smells after an evening wind. Women touched stone that had been touched until it learned a shine. A child counted the steps to the sanctum, lost count, and began again with good humour. An old man showed a young one how to make a circumambulation feel like listening rather than asking. When the priest lifted a small lamp and circled it before the deity, light became a language again, and the crowd's eyes followed as if reading a line everyone somehow already knew by heart. He remembered the sea roads and the ships whose ribs learned to keep season with monsoon and mercy. He could almost smell resin and pepper beneath the fragrance of camphor, as if trade winds had wandered into the sanctum and decided to behave. It is possible, he thought, that temples learned their scale from the ocean and their patience from libraries and their tenderness from pillars that ask governments to be gentle. And perhaps the artisans who knew both geology and breath had acted as translators among the three. Some will argue still, Dravida and Nagara, Vimana and Shikara, which lineage carried which seed along which path, whether a northern curve means mind and a southern mass means body. Arguments as intricate as jewellery, thoughtful and sincere. But the body listening in this cool chamber felt only a friendliness of space, a square that knew how to hold without pinching, a tower that knew how to rise without swaggering. At noon the shadow of the tower shortened to a large comma on the flagstones, and he took shelter beneath a colonnade where carved dancers taught the edges of shade to move. A mason passed, Hands whitened with the dust of a morning's exactness, he touched a pillar lightly, the way a musician touches a string, not to sound it, but to confirm its temper. Nearby a scribe traced a verse about distances travelled by mind. Farther along, a vendor tied jasmine into a long white thought and sold it to a girl who promised to let the flowers remember her hair. He realised that even the market outside the temple had learned the cadence of the inner court, the bargaining polite, the speech softened by pauses, the coins clink absorbed into a wider murmur like a brook that refuses to hurry itself into riverhood. Toward evening, when the stone took on the colour of old honey, he walked the outermost ring once more, and laid his palm against the southern wall. The heat stored there stepped into his skin like a guest who knows the house well. Thought turned to cloth then, the way sculpted dancers wore pleats like waves, the way the gods' scarves seemed to gust from a carved wind, the way a temple's own stone sometimes looked draped in a sari of shadow. He imagined a court far to the north, where silk moved like quiet water and the edges of empire met their delicate tests. He imagined scholars seated under a painted eave, their fingers stained with ink the colour of distant plums, debating what makes elegance durable and what keeps a frontier from fraying. As lamps bloomed along the temple's waist and the sanctum's flame steadied into its night breath, the tower watched the first star with the serenity of a mountain that had practiced stillness for centuries, and somewhere beyond the last coconut grove, a banner of fine weave lifted in a courtyard breeze, hinting at music, treaties, and the soft rustle of a golden age about to speak. In the northern court, where silk moved like quiet water, the day wore a measured radiance. Colonnades painted with tender blues and copper reds, a pavilion where the breeze turned the fringe of a royal parasol into a small tide, scribes bent to palm leaf like gardeners thinning a bed so seeds might have room. It felt as if elegance had decided to test its strength, not in gold, but in restraint. He stood at the edge of that well-bred light and watched courtiers walk as if time were an instrument and they had learned the gentlest way to play it. Poets waited under a fig whose leaves spoke in polished hexameters. A dramatist, with a gaze like rain, described a cloud that carried love letter and monsoon at once. A jeweller arranged gems as if they were syllables, seeking a metre. An astronomer traced a circle on dust and found in its quiet a language for the sky. The old motifs wandered in wearing new garments. The first hearth square became the courtyard's plan. The pillars' council softened into edicts of civility, where even victory wore a light step. The Nalanda lamp had travelled inward, making libraries of minds that preferred clarity to noise. Craftsmen laid their hands on stone, bronze, pigment, cloth, and the world answered with a poise that felt like mercy, dressed for court. He thought of RTA again, the fittedness of things, now visible in a wrist's turn, a dancer's ankle, a line of script that neither shouted nor slept. In a side hall, a scribe copied a play about kings and messengers, and a lover who mistakes the sky for a letter. His brush did not rush, for the actors of ink must breathe as human ones do. Far away, the sea still rehearsed the monsoon's vow. Here, in inland air, the seasons kept a calendar on the flowering of mango and the slope of shadows across stone. Yet any grace worth the name must learn to stand near its opposite, and the news from the edges arrived like a wind with grit in it. Hunters from the hard north tested the seams of empire. Horsemen wrote their brief arguments on the frontier's dust. Watchtowers learned to blink more often. In campfires at the borders, maps were drawn with sticks, and the word tomorrow meant distance more than day. He listened, without tightening. The court's elegance did not pretend the wind had changed. It lowered its voice to be heard better. Generals, who had learned geometry as boys, now measured not only walls and bridges, but the fragile arithmetic of lives, how to keep a village from emptying itself into fear, how to teach a road to be brave without being foolish. A king's edict could still be kind, he realized, and when kindness had to stand in armour, it could keep its eyes level. Under banners dyed in steady colours, supply lines moved like careful veins. Wells were dug along routes, so soldiers and strangers might drink from the same mouth of earth. Back at court, the poets did not stop their work, they widened it. A verse about clouds grew a shadow of vigilance. A comedy learned to carry a lantern through the dark without scaring the sleepers. The astronomer refined his circle until it spoke in numbers that could guide a ship as surely as a prayer guides a heart. If debates later would count which year this frontier held, whether this king or that bore more strain, whether the line bent here or there, the night's more modest truth was simply that people kept one another warm with shared purpose, and the empire, like a loom under weather, tightened its threads without snapping. Travelling south and west with the caravan of his own thoughts, he stepped into galleries where walls remembered night as a pigment. In the caves, lamps consented to a small labour, and painters taught rock to dream. Bodhisattvas with eyes like patient wells, princes who had traded rooms for open roads, women whose bracelets chimed with the uphill steps of compassion. Colours lay like whispers. Lapis that had learned deep water's secret, red that kept a hearth's last breath, green that knew the underside of leaves at noon. Musicians paused in stone to let a note go on being born. Elephants balanced dignity and play as only memory-rich creatures can. Attendants loosened curtains caught in a wind no one felt, the breath of a story rising. He traced a figure's outline with his gaze and found, to his quiet delight, that the line did not end where it seemed to. It curled into another, and then another, until the composition was less a frieze than a choreography taught to pigment. Outside, bees rehearsed a rag in yellow around a spray of flowers. Inside, the brush kept time with their minute thunder. The same attention that once squared a hearth now squared a wrist's motion. The same law that taught a pillar to carry compassion taught a profile to hold both beauty and inwardness without quarrel. Between scenes of kings and hermitages, a slender deer stepped from shadow to light and back again, as if showing him how to move between worlds without losing his softness. He walked out at dusk, and the courtly air met the frontier wind on his skin. They did not fight there either. In the quiet, he imagined the capital's evening, scholars unrolling their calculations in lamplight, a child learning to name stars before sleep, a playwright leaning on a balcony to eavesdrop on the city's small music. Then the sentries on an outpost hearing the same constellations unlock the hours, swapping stories in a whisper so as not to unnerve the horses. Somewhere an iron pillar stood under the open sky and declined to rust, a modest sermon about how firmness can live without shouting. Somewhere a village potter pressed his thumbs into wet clay, marking a future bowl with the same crescent the moon now rehearsed. The empire, he understood, was not merely a court or a border, but a behaviour, a way of carrying strength as if it were a sleeping child. And when the lamp of this age dimmed, as all lamps must, its ember would roll forward into other forms, into numbers that tightened the measure of time, into stories that taught wisdom in the voices of animals and fools and kings alike, into grammars of light and thought that could hold a world without clenching. Night took a deeper breath. From the fig tree of poets came the soft fall of a ripe phrase, From the barracks of the march, a rhythm of boots like rain that refuses to be cruel. From the caves, a silence full of colour returned to its source, grateful. He gathered the threads: fire, pillar, library, ship, temple, court, frontier, and felt how they wished to braid themselves into something one could carry in a pocket and consult when lost. He thought of children who might never see a court but would learn justice from a jackal who lies and gets found out. He thought of a young prince who might become wise because a parrot told a better story than a stern tutor. He thought of a traveller whose sleep would come easier for having heard a tale in which a small kindness rearranged a fate. Lanterns tipped their light onto the road as if pouring it carefully into a mould. Somewhere beyond the last guard post, in a village where the well kept the stars in a shallow bowl, an old storyteller cleared his throat, and the animals of the night, cunning, faithful, foolish, brave, leaned closer to lend their voices to what would come next. He found the storyteller by the village well, where the night kept the stars in a shallow bowl, and the rope creaked like an old violin. The man's voice began, not with a flourish, but with a kindness, as if tucking a child into sleep. And then the forest arrived, pads of paws in leaf murmur, the clever glint of a jackal's eyes, a turtle's patient face, a monkey whose laughter could braid mischief with mercy. The animals moved with the same fittedness he had learned beneath pillars and in temples, but here the law came soft, wrapped in fur and feather, so it would not frighten the young. The old man's hands drew arcs in the air. A lantern beside him behaved like an attentive moon, and each tale stepped lightly from one to the next, like beads on a prayer string. How a crow, black as the hour itself, outwits greed. How a deer's trust goes astray and finds its way back. How counsel, when spoken in the wrong ear, becomes a snare. How friendship can be both a bridge and a storm, depending on the weight one places upon it. He recognized, with a small inward smile, the same grammar he had met in cloisters and courts, but simplified into heartbeat and breath. The forest might change species, the plot might trade garments, but the lesson felt like RTA humming at ground level, the world seam holding stitch by stitch through ordinary choices. Some scholars would later ask which branch of the tales grew first, whether the stories that travelled west as Kalila and Dimna carried their trunks from this very grove, or from a neighbouring wood, whether a single author's hand had traced their first paths, or whether the village, like soil, was the real author, feeding roots no one could see. He let the debate pass like wind through leaves. The felt truth was that the stories behaved like seeds that had learned to walk. Around the well, listeners leaned in without moving, women with bangles softening the dark with a rain of small sounds. A potter whose day had shaped vessels, now letting his mind be shaped. A child whose eyelids fluttered as if dreaming had arrived early and set out mats for sleep. In the pause between tales, the rope sang as the bucket rose from coolness, and the water, lipping the rim, looked up at the stars as if to confirm they were still there. He heard, in the old man's cadence, far coasts and high passes, a faint accent of caravans, a whisper of ship-rigging, as if the forest itself had been listening at ports and markets and learning new ways to greet strangers. Somewhere a scribe, or many, over many winters, would nudge these voices onto palm leaf so that the animals could travel easier than hoof or wing. Somewhere a court would ask a gentleman to tutor a prince with these fables, choosing a deer over a sermon, a jackal over a statute, because sometimes wisdom enters better when it wears a mask. He thought of the pillars' lions and smiled. Even stone, set to guard the four directions, might approve of these supple cousins who patrolled the inner borders of the heart. The tales were not shy about shadow. In one, a cobra learned humility at the price of speed. In another, a mouse saved a lion because size has nothing to do with gratitude. Sometimes the trickster's victory tasted like ash by dawn, and sometimes the generous fool outlived the clever miser, and the children listening understood without knowing that they understood. The old man's lamp, like the first hearth's flame, did its small luminous work, lettering faces in gold, refusing to shout, insisting instead on clarity. He noticed the gentle arithmetic at play, how one story hid inside another like a bird inside a fig, how a fable declared itself finished and then politely offered a new thread for the next. When an owl scraped its surprise from a branch, the storyteller merely absorbed the sound and handed it back to the night as a moral about vigilance that does not harden into suspicion. He realized that libraries could be ambulatory, that a village square could hold as much wisdom as stacked volumes if the air was patient and the listeners treated one another kindly. And he watched the boy who drew circles in dust. Yes, the same one from another riverbank, older now, find in these loops the safe geometry of choice. Turn here and be spared, turn there and learn slowly. Take this path and your friend becomes your teacher rather than your mirror. Gentle arguments would ripple through time about where the stories turned next. Persia, Syria, Al-Andalus, how they borrowed and repaid in the markets of language, how a storyteller in a different tongue bent a fox's joke to fit a new moon. But the current underneath was simple and generous. The animal voices taught a human poise. Even a king, wrapped in 7 names and a parasol shade, might need to hear a turtle speak of slowness before he learned to wait for intelligence to ripen. Even a merchant, counting profits in pepper and pearl, might lay the ledger down for a night after a deer taught him that fear shortens the road to ruin. When the old man reached for one last tale, the well seemed to listen, the rope quieted. The stars lowered their chins to the lip of darkness. In that closing story, a flock of birds bound by a net learned to live together, not by strength but by timing. He felt the Nalanda lamp, the temple's patient square, the monsoon's steady law, and the pillar's quiet counsel, all nod at once. The net rose, not because any single wing was mighty, but because the rhythm of many became a sky. He carried that picture like a soft instrument against his ribs. When the storyteller tied the night's mouth with a thread of silence, people exhaled as if waking from a dream arranged by kindness. The lantern pinched itself smaller. The well's light returned to its depth. The village's dogs agreed to escort the last sleepers home at a dignified pace. He lingered, tasting the afterglow of morals that refused to scold. Something else had arrived along the edges of these tales, a weather not yet named in his journey, the way hearts lean forward without being ordered, the way a song that is not about a god can still prepare a room for one. The air felt tuned for devotion, not the loud kind that shakes banners in a wind, but the soft thunder that runs under speech when love becomes a road. Far off, as if answering a call the night had kept private, a human voice, untrained, aching, sincere, touched a single note that neither rose nor fell. It sounded like a door opening in a wall that had forgotten it could move. He turned toward it, feeling how stories might grow limbs and walk into song, how counsel might become longing, how law might learn to bow to a sweeter gravity. The path to that voice lay through sleeping fields and along a canal that kept the moon in pieces. Above it, constellations stitched their soft treaties. Beneath it, the earth remembered every foot that had ever walked toward a listening presence. And in the half-dark, The first stirrings of a new age gathered, warm as a hand over a small flame. The voice he had heard, untrained, aching, sincere, was not alone. By dawn it had braided itself with other voices until the air seemed woven of longing, and he found himself at the edge of a small shrine where no grandeur interfered, a low wall, warm with sun, a neem offering its measured shade, a clay lamp steady as a heartbeat. A woman with flour still whitening her wrists sang as if she were kneading the day into kindness. A potter set down his coil and let a refrain ring inside the empty bowl he was shaping. A shepherd leaned his staff against the door and stood straight, as if love had corrected his posture. The song was simple, names like beads, breath like thread, and yet its power moved like monsoon through sleep-dry fields. He recognized old companions arriving in new clothes, the first fire, now the small steady lamp that anybody could afford, the pillar's law, now softened into a vow a heart could keep without a decree. Nalanda's lamp, now light in the eyes of people who had never seen a university but had learned attention by milking at dawn, by listening to goats remember their kids. The temple's square, now the circle of joined palms. The saints who walked these roads wore dust and did not mind. They sang in tongues that made no one apologize. Tamil and Hindi, Kannada and Marathi, Bengali and Braj, each carrying a local warmth into the common shelter of devotion. He felt how doctrine, which had often sat like an elder at the head of the room, now took a cushion at the circle's edge, smiling to see love carry the conversation without losing the sense of measure. Historians would later chart names and dates with respectful care. Andal's bridal hunger for the divine, Tukaram's poems scratched into the air of a riverbank, Mirabai's refusal to be contained by walls, Namalvar's inward garden taught to bloom in words, Kabir's loom teaching threads to pray while they crossed. But the felt truth in the hour was that longing had learned to be a craft, and anyone with breath could practice it. The shrine had no gatekeeper. People arrived as rivers do, by necessity, by curiosity, by thirst. A farmer came with a complaint and left with the complaint reduced to a shape he could carry without hating it. A widow brought quiet and took away a song. Children arrived with dust and left with dust, singing. Between couplets, someone poured water from a metal lota, and the sound of it completed the meter. The saints, when they spoke between songs, did not fetch their authority from lineage or script, but from the seam they stitched in listeners' chests, a sense that the world, though full of breakage, had a mending thread passing through it, fine as hair and strong as love. The old word RTA circled back, not as cosmic law now, but as a rightness felt in the body when a verse and a tear arrived together and neither apologized. He noticed, too, how the songs carried disagreement without harm. One praised form, another formlessness, this one called God by a childhood name, while that one would not say any name at all, and yet the courtyard did not split. Each utterance was a clay cup, water poured into all and quenched. Later, a scholar would compare this to rivers joining a sea they cannot see from their banks. He preferred the humbler picture before him, a circle of listeners whose elbows sometimes touched and who never minded. On the wall, a small chalk drawing, two fish chasing one another into a unity neither could achieve alone, learned to be a theology. A breeze lifted the lamp smell and braided it with jasmine from someone's hair. A cow, unself-conscious, put its face through the doorway and seemed to nod to the rhythm. He watched the saints move through towns, as if through rooms of one house they didn't own, sleeping under eaves or on temple steps, under bullock carts when rain failed to arrive. They knew the geography of wells and shade trees, the way a scholar knows the chapters of a treatise, and wherever they set down their walking sticks, a congregation knitted itself from whatever thread lay to hand, a weaver's offcuts, a mason's lunch break, a child's afternoon. The songs needed little. 2 lines, a hand clap, a reed flute willing to be humble. And with these, the day was persuaded to let go of its hardness. He thought of the animal stories by the well, of the birds who rose together with a net still upon them, and realized he was watching the same lesson now in human pitch, many breath beats learning to lift as one. Power, which so often arrived on horseback or under a parasol, came here barefoot and made no announcement. Sometimes a magistrate listened from the shade, like a thirsty man pretending not to drink. Sometimes a landlord found his voice entering the refrain against his own surprise, and afterward gave grain to the shrine because he could not name what else the song had given him. The saints were not indifferent to pain. They sought it out as a blacksmith seeks iron. Where caste fenced the air into small yards, they walked through the gates with their voices and left them unlatched. Where ritual trembled on one foot, they steadied it by teaching the other to dance. Where despair had taken a seat and learned how to stay, they pulled up another stool and told it a joke so gentle that it forgot its lines. Toward evening, the shrine became briefly indistinguishable from the street, and then, by some courtesy nobody owned, it reappeared, a room made entirely of song. He thought of the pillar again, standing on an older plain with lions facing the 4 directions. Now the lions were human throats, turned toward east and west and north and south, guarding not a kingdom's reach, but a tenderness crossing borders no army could tax. Lamps were lit. Here a flame that had learned patience from kitchens. There a taper cut from a larger light, like a sentence shared by many mouths. The songs thickened into honey and then thinned into air, and in the dilution he felt a preparation for a different music, one that loved the same listener by another name. Off in a quarter he did not yet know, a reed was being cut and hollowed, its green heart removed so it could learn to speak longing without choking on itself. A courtyard waited, where whirling would turn grief into a circle, and silence into fruit. Between this shrine and that future one ran a simple road, not paved, edged with huts and little shops and a boy selling sweet milk in clay cups. He would later break, as if to remind drinkers that vessels are temporary and content is not. The saint's last refrain for the day moved off in the throats of those who had gathered. He followed at a distance, letting the dust rise gently to meet his ankles. Night lifted its scarf to cover the fields. The neem's leaves counted their blessings. Somewhere a window opened on an inner room, where the same love would be taught to breathe with a different vowel, and in the pause, before the first flute note, the world held its breath like a lamp cupped in 2 careful hands. The courtyard was not large, yet it seemed to contain a horizon. A neem leaned over the wall to eavesdrop. Pigeons rehearsed their soft percussion, and in the centre a lamp threw a coin of light onto stone worn smooth by generations of slow feet. He entered as one enters a friend's kitchen, without ceremony, with gratitude, and felt how the room had been made porous to the sky. A reed flute lifted its first note, low as a confession. Someone had carved the heart out of that reed so it could learn to speak of longing without choking on itself, and the lesson had become a music that warmed the evening like bread. Men in loose cotton and women with veils like drifting water settled along the edges. A boy fetched brass cups of sweet tea, and a girl arranged flowers whose scent folded the air into tenderness. The sheikh, not young, not old, came without announcement and sat where the light did not insist on him. His hand turned a string of beads, not counting so much as listening. Zikr rose, names circling a centre that could not be named, breath polishing breath, and the old motifs returned like loyal friends. The first fire, now a coal, cupped in collective palms. The pillar's counsel, now a vow kept by the softness of voices. Nalanda's lamp, now a patience trained to listen between syllables. The temple square, now a circle that included even those who did not yet know they were welcome. A young singer cleared his throat, and the courtyard leaned forward. Qawwali began, drumskin learning the speed of the heart, clapping hands sewing the seams of attention, voices building an arch that held even the weary without asking where they had come from. Love had many names here, and none of them felt jealous. Ishq, a sweet thunder. Rahman, a mercy that takes the weight from the day. Chuda, who is not far even when the mind is full of fences. No one asked for papers at the door. Langar waited in shadow, pots keeping a quiet sun under their lids. He thought of roads again, how they braid ideas into lives. In the West, he had heard, a man once spun until his grief learned to turn into prayer. Here, the turning often happened in place, a circle in the chest widening until it included the evening star. The Chishti saints had walked these lanes with bare feet and large hearing. Mu'inuddin of Ajmer teaching the gate to forget the word closed. Nizamuddin in Delhi, coaxing the city to rediscover its kindness. A poet named Khusrau, tying languages together with ribbons of melody until strangers recognized their mother's voice in a new grammar. Historians, kindly exact, would later ask how the currents braided, how Persian garden and Hindustani field learned to share water, how metaphors of wine and tavern poured themselves into a land where other rules prevailed. They would note how a sarod once listened to an oud, how a ghazal learned to soften its steps for a courtyard with bare feet. The debates are honest as weather. Yet tonight the felt truth moved, like a tide. Suffering was being gently retuned, selfhood thinned to a kindness that could pass through needle eyes, and hunger, of the heart more than the body, was invited to sit and be fed first. Zikr kept time. A dervish in the corner did not whirl. He breathed with such steadiness that the pigeons seemed to borrow his measure. The sheikh spoke at last quietly. The reed teaches by absence. Hollow yourselves of noise. Let longing do its clean work. It was not a command. It was an old friend's reminder to set down the sack for a while and feel one's shoulders belong to the sky. He recognized the seam of RTA again, translated into love's grammar. Where the Vedic square once taught offering, the circle now taught surrender. Where the pillar had asked governors to be gentle, the song asked the heart to govern itself by mercy. Where Nalanda had turned attention into knowledge, the Kanka turned attention into gratitude that could walk on 2 feet and share bread. The poor came unashamed. The proud came and discovered they had been thirsty. A labourer's laugh stitched the room together. On the wall, a calligrapher had taught letters to lean into one another until they resembled a vine. The script felt like water instructed to remember its own curve. Somewhere, in another quarter, a temple bell sounded the hour, and the drum answered, not with rivalry, but with welcome. He understood then how rivers keep their names while making a sea together. Even the arguments found a seat. Those who preferred form, those who preferred emptiness, those who loved God's face, those who loved the radiance that shines without a face. None were turned away. The sheikh only reminded the room that love sits nearest to silence, and that silence is simply a doorway no one owns. Between songs the courtyard exhaled. A beggar ate beside a merchant, with the shy ease of cousins at a long-delayed reunion. A widow found that her grief could rock to this rhythm so without being scolded into cheer. A soldier let his jaw unhook, and for a moment held no border but the one between his ribs and the night air. Someone recited a couplet that tasted of almond and dust, how the beloved hides in the ordinary, and the ordinary becomes a gate when named with care. Over the roof, the first star discovered itself in a shallow pool of water kept for ablutions. It trembled a little and then became calm. He felt the earlier ages assemble themselves for a moment inside this modest room. The hearth by the river, the pillar in the plain, the university where wind turned pages, the harbour that wore the monsoon like a garland, the temple that built a cosmos from a square. All of them had been practicing this posture, this trained softness that allows the world to be remade without breaking it. The last song rose and did not end so much as open. The reed's final note hung like a bridge that refused to collapse into either shore. When quiet came, it did not erase the music. It held it the way a garden holds water after rain. He stood, and the stone underfoot approved his leaving. Beyond the Khanka's gate, the city breathed in many languages at once, vendors praising their fruit, children chalking territories that would be forgotten by noon, a scholar arguing tenderly with an almond seller about the price of wisdom and nuts. A breeze arrived, carrying a scent he could not place at first, rose, yes, and wet earth, and something else. Water made geometric, flowing along channels that taught shade to become cool thought. He followed that fragrance, through lanes that remembered footfall, and turned into a garden where sound spelled itself in 4 calm scripts. The hush of cypress, the small arithmetic of rills, the softened footstep of a lover arriving late and forgiven, the silence of moonlight practicing handwriting on a pool. The reed's last breath met the water's first word, and in their meeting a new lesson prepared itself, about order that soothes without scolding, about beauty that keeps a city kind. Far down the path, night arranged the outlines of pavilions like unwritten couplets, and the stars leaned close to read them, too. The garden drew him in, with the sound of water doing arithmetic. 1, 2, 4, rills, dividing and meeting again, until the whole place felt like a poem translated into pools. Under cypress and plane trees, the air learned to be cool, even when the day still smouldered, and the gravel paths, combed by patient hands, held the memory of footsteps so gently that no dust dared rise. He moved beneath an arch that knew how to frame the sky, and the evening's first star found itself mirrored in a channel that had practiced stillness all afternoon. The reflection shivered once and then settled, as if the water had signed the star's name in a script only gardeners could read. Charbagh, the fourfold plan, revealed itself slowly, not as a rule imposed, but as a kindness extended. Quarters that conversed across water, beds edged like verses, geometry that soothed the day's ragged edges without insisting on obedience. He recognized old companions in new guises. The Vedic square, now platted with shade and fountain. The pillar's council, now a path that led both prince and porter to the same pavilion. Nalanda's attention, now the way a gardener thinned buds so the survivors could sweeten. The Khanka's breath, now a breeze that lifted the scent of rose, until even the tired remembered they had lungs made for gratitude. A pair of herons wrote white sentences along the dusk. A peacock, suddenly shy, kept its blue like a secret under the low branches. From somewhere behind a carved screen came the mild clink of cups and the faint forgiving music of strings. The garden was an instrument tuned to keep the city kind. He paused where a charbagh, the stone's patient cascade, let water comb itself into silk. Some would later debate whose imagination first planted this order in dust, Persian gardens translated east, or older Indian courtyards teaching their cousin a new grammar, whether the paradise quadrants arrived with a caravan of metaphors or rose from wells that had always known how to draw a square around mercy. The arguments are honest and necessary, yet in this hour the felt truth moved. Like twilight, the garden braided lineages the way a plait holds many strands, and in its braid no strand was asked to cancel another. An emperor's memory walked here too, not in triumph, but in attention, the way he listened to a cypress choose its angle, or to a mason coax water into the shallowest fall that would still speak. In the north, the Kashmir breeze practiced pronouncing Shalimar. In other provinces, moonlight lettered Aram Bagh, Mehtab Bagh with the same soft hand. At the river's elbow, a white tombs taught reflection to be doctrine and not merely accident. Water doubled everything so no one would feel alone. Tree and echo tree, star and star again. Pavilion and its ghost that could be walked in without touching the floor. He leaned over a pool where lotuses kept their own calendar, and the night began, petal by petal. Servants moved like good grammar, unnoticed when perfect, refilling lamps shaped like small boats so that fire could learn to float. A girl brought jasmines whose scent rewrote the air's fatigue. A gardener's palms, calloused and exact, tested the soil with a tenderness that made the world seem worth the trouble of tending. He saw how power chose to behave here, not as display but as a promise that order would be merciful, that shade would be available to knees that had knelt all day at market, that water would speak softly to tempers that had learned to flare. A poet under a shinar counted the ways a moon can enter water without drowning. A mathematician on a bench faced a rill the way he faced a theorem, with a respect for the curve that makes the straight line meaningful. A child released a paper boat into the slow current and bowed to it as if to a small envoy. Somewhere a court singer rehearsed a bandish that refused to hurry the hour. The notes stepped like careful footprints across a newly swept floor, and the garden agreed to accompany, its fountains finding the tala as naturally as birds find dawn. He could taste cardamom in the air, a spoon of sherbet in imagined heat, the cool edge of a cup that remembered other lips with forgiving clarity. He felt the patience of stone underfoot, how it bore weight without commentary. Not all was tranquil even here. A rumour of march carried faintly on the outer wind, the world beyond the wall remembering its responsibilities in rougher accents. Gardeners knew which leaves would bruise at news, and kept their pruning for later. Inside the order, hospitality became a kind of governance. A gate opened a little wider, a guard loosened his jaw and let his eyes be kinder. A senior eunuch adjusted a lantern so its light fell more generously on a bench where two men, equals only in moonlight, discussed the price of grain without raising their voices. He thought of how empires breathe. In, when roads are safe and caravans keep their appointments. Out, when borders test their hem and must be mended without tearing the cloth. The garden taught both, the art of receiving, the craft of restraint. A firefly practiced punctuation over the hibiscus. The star it echoed practiced patience. Between the rills, plots of fragrant earth glimmered, saffron when the season declared itself, marigold like captive suns, roses that seemed to remember deserts they had never seen. And beyond the roses, in a corner where the moon came late, A narrow bed of blue hinted at another story. Indigo, asleep in green leaves, dreamed of vats and deep transformations. Cotton, beyond the wall in fields that knew the monsoon's timetable, swayed under an inland breeze. Muslin, not yet woven, waited in the silence between two nightbirds' calls, as sheer and invisible as a promise. He felt how the garden's geometry wished to travel into cloth, borders that keep calm, motifs that persuade the eye to rest, a measured generosity that could be worn. If scholars would someday weigh thread counts and trace the long routes of colour from plant to vat, vat to loom, loom to wrist and royal shoulder, the pool at his feet already understood. Water writes names on air and teaches hand and eye to believe in fineness that asks for no applause. When the moon climbed high enough to wear the pavilion as a ring, he sat and listened to the smallest sounds, a drop finding its echo, a leaf surrendering to gravity without melodrama, a footfall choosing gravel over grass out of courtesy. He felt the earlier ages assembling again, hearth, pillar, library, ship, temple, court, tale, hymn, garden, each reminding the other how to be gentle and still endure. The night did not conclude. It softened. A breeze, having washed itself in rose, wandered toward the sleeping city where looms would wake before dawn. In courtyards, women would lift wet skeins the colour of first sky. In hidden rooms, vats would darken like thinking. On nimble frames, a cloth almost too honest to be believed would begin to appear between fingers that respected silence. The garden, satisfied with its lesson, handed him to that quieter industry. He rose, and as he walked out under an arch, where stars wrote their signatures without hurrying, a thread of blue followed him in the mind, thin, strong, river-soft, leading toward rooms where water learned to become colour, and colour learned to become breath. The hall knew the footfall before the feet arrived, as if stone kept a memory of fear and hope, and had learned to soften itself for the light steps of a girl. Ariadne moved through the moon-blued corridors with a lantern cupped like a small sun, the flame bending each time she turned as though it were trying to read her face. The palace at Knossos slept in layers, courtyards stacked with the breath of bulls and dancers, storerooms folded with the hush of oil and grain. Yet somewhere beneath, like a slow thought, the island could not stop thinking. The labyrinth waited. Some said it was a building, some said a mind, some said a family's grief that had learned geometry. In any case, it breathed. Its passages tasted of lime and salt, of old storms caught in plaster. Ariadne had a thread and a decision, two things small enough to hide in a hand and large enough to tilt a world. In the courtyard above, dolphins leapt in paint that never tired. Fresco lilies kept their scarlet laughter. The double axe, the labris, rested in a mural with a patience that felt like law. But law had wandered. It was lost in the dim where a boy from across the sea waited to be brave or to become meat for a myth. Theseus had not slept. He paced softly under a low arch, counting breaths to teach the heart a kinder measure. His ship still rocked in him, a phantom tide clicking at his ribs. He remembered the sea road to Crete, blue like a god that cannot help being itself, and the song the oars made when pulled by strangers who trusted one another quickly, because that is how stories begin. He looked up when Ariadne came, and in the falling of his shoulders she saw how courage loves company. He was not a statue pretending to be a man. He was a man willing to carry a hope that did not belong to him alone. She told him what the thread could do. Not fight, not charm, not command, but remember, tie it to the world and let it learn your path, the way a river's edge learns a boat. She tied the first knot herself, at a hook near the door, fingers sure though the night had put moths in her stomach. She had grown up among corridors that turned like questions, and it comforted her to make one thing straight. Some say she loved him in that moment, his unarmoured listening, the way he held silence as carefully as he held the sword. Others say she loved the possibility of an island not ruled by fear. The myths can be kind or cruel, depending on the moon. Scholars, gentler in tone than the old bards, will argue over Crete's power, how much of the labyrinth walked in ritual rather than stone, whether the bull was a god or a sport, whether the minotaur was a monster or simply sorrow wearing horns. But the night itself did not argue. It held the lantern and watched. They descended. The stair was a spine the earth had lent to human uncertainty. Each landing leaned into the next, as if listening for news. Theseus touched the walls the way a child touches a father's sleeve in a festival crowd to stay found. Chalk dust took his fingerprints and made of them a pale family on stone. The air thickened, as if the Minotaur were a thought whose weight the rooms could feel from far away. He did not boast. He had learned on ships that men who talk too loudly at dusk row poorly at dawn. Inside, the labyrinth changed its mind often. A right turn taught humility, a left turn taught patience. Ariadne let the thread play out with the relaxed strength of someone feeding rope to a boat that must find its birth by feel. She hummed a tune older than speech, a line her nurse used when storms wished to become children and failed. Even the torch leaned closer. There were places where the floor remembered dance and others where it remembered dread, and in both the dust lifted with the same small courtesy and then lay down again. The bull's scent met them, a musk of hay and ache, and then the breath, impossible to miss, a bellows made of grief and hunger. The first glimpse was not horns, but eyes, not madness, not rage exactly, but a long bewilderment salted into violence by years of being told what he was. Theseus stood. The sword did not tremble, but neither did it crow. They circled each other in a silence that would not have been out of place in a temple. The blow, when it came, was not clever. It was sufficient, which is a different wisdom. He struck once more to keep mercy from being theatrical. The Minotaur slipped into a stillness that did not argue with the earth. Somewhere above, a fresco of dancers continued to be light forever, unconcerned with the weight below. Somewhere beyond, the harbour counted the lamps of sleepless ships. Ariadne's thread lay like a pale river between them and home. They stood in the afterward, which is a country that even heroes rarely describe. Theseus wiped the blade not as a victor but as a caretaker, unwilling to leave a stain for someone else to wonder about. Ariadne closed the lantern with a palm's small ceremony. She felt the island shift slightly, as when a sleeper turns from a bad dream toward a window. The way back was a lesson in how memory can be as brave as strength, no flourish, only keeping to a promise, made knot by knot. The labyrinth, now that no dread pulled at its heart, seemed almost helpful. Echoes softened, corners rounded. At the stair, they stood longer than they needed to, as if listening for any sound that might be a second life calling. There was none. Above, halls unfolded with the mildness of rooms after fever. Even the painted bulls looked less like threats and more like animals who wanted to be left in their fields. They walked to the sea with the care of conspirators who wished to harm no one, and the city slept too hard to wake. The ship woke instantly. Ships are like dogs, incorrigibly alert to the nearness of the ones who ask them for distance. The leaving is its own myth. Some say she went with him, carrying the island's future in a handful of choices. Some say he left her on a coast where other gods knew her truer name and taught her a crown of stars. Some say promises fray at sea, as all rope does, and that this is neither sin nor excuse, only weather. He watched her on the deck in the first light, the thread coiled in her lap like a tame horizon, and felt gratitude that was too large for speech. He promised what men promise when the wind is briefly perfect. The black sail kept its secret. Far behind, Crete turned in its sleep. Far ahead, another island raised a shoulder from the blue, as if to offer a place to rest. The oars learned a new rhythm, the steady grammar of escape, and the wake wrote a letter that moonlight could read but not keep. Scholars will say later that this tale is about civic mind over wild force, or about the knife a city hides in a girl's soft hand when it tires of sacrifice, or about how cunning, when linked to care, can be nobility. He thought simpler that a thread can be a teacher, and that courage sometimes means remembering the way back. Toward the horizon, a darker line drew itself. A ship's trail, a promise, a question. And somewhere beyond that line, in a harbour that smelled of resin and prophecy, a different crew was gathering around a timber painted with the first syllables of a name that would carry both glory and ash. Oars waiting, ropes murmuring. A woman with unsleeping eyes, already weighing love against fate, as the sea rehearsed its old persuading song. Dawn found the ship already awake, ribs creaking softly as if remembering the trees they once were, and on the shingle men moved with the quiet choreography of those who had chosen a long promise and were now learning its particular steps. The prow kept its eye on the horizon, a woman's painted gaze that had watched many tides and would watch many more. They called her Argo, and she seemed to recognize her name each time the sea laid a hand along her flank. Jason walked the strand with a coil of rope, like a patient sentence in his arms, and the oarsmen, kings for the day, labourers for the hour, tested their benches with the small respect one gives to instruments that will know one's breath better than any lover. The old motifs arrived in salt-coloured garments, the hearth square becoming a deck where each place had its fit, the pillars' counsel turning into rules spoken low. Who rows when? Who keeps the lamp? Who speaks to wind as if to an elder? The temple's hush found again in the pause before the first stroke. Nalanda's lamp returning as attention sharpened into navigation, stars learning the names on the crew's tongues. Scholars would later list the crew with calendared pride, Heracles for strength, Orpheus for measure, Castor and Polydeuces for the grace of hands, a helmsman whose eyes could persuade a reef to step aside. But the sea had its own roster, courage, fatigue, doubt, laughter, a stubborn willingness to turn back, only if turning back was also a kind of courage. The quest was for a fleece that shone like a lifted dawn, a pelt heavy with the weight of a story older than the men rowing under it. The oath was to bring it home, not because gold changes lives, but because oaths, once uttered, asked to be answered. They left the familiar headland, and the coast unstitched itself behind them, with the reluctant grace of cloth from a careful seam. Day swam ahead in pale fish bones, and the first island lifted like a thought seeking its word. At the prow stood a timber from a sacred grove, a fragment of oak that had learned to speak, or so the elders swore. Sometimes it murmured advice in a voice like wind caught in a jar, and sometimes it was content to be wood that kept its silence well. He noticed how the boat taught them before any god did, how the oars must enter water as a single thought if distance is to be persuaded, how the man who listens can hold the tiller straighter than the man who insists, how the cook is often the hidden governor of morale. When a squall arrived, sudden and argumentative, Orpheus loosed a thread of sound into the air, and the crew felt their ribs remember a kinder rhythm. The storm did not vanish, but it changed habits, circling the ship as a wolf encircles a fire that refuses fear. At night the mast learned to be a finger pointing at constellations that had endured many names, without preference. A seal lifted its head, like an old man amused by youth. They traded with coast dwellers for figs and water, grips and glances handled with the care that strangers use when they wish to keep the evening free of knives. In coves the stone kept the day's heat, the way a faithful friend keeps secrets. On open water, light walked the waves with a priest's deliberate pace. Colchis did not hurry to reveal itself. Kingdoms that know their own gravity seldom do. The river there moved like a sentence with clauses, long and patient, and on its bank a king measured newcomers the way a smith measures iron, with a gaze that could imagine many shapes and trusted none of them to be inevitable. Aeetes' words were not cruel, but they were ironed flat by caution. He had sisters who remembered being wronged by the gods, and daughters who knew what exile tastes like even before they had lifted a foot from home. Jason, who had once been sent away in a cloak too big for his shoulders and had learned to grow into it, spoke without swagger. He asked for the fleece and offered stories he hoped would be accepted as coin. The king weighed the exchange and offered tasks instead. Fields waited, that did not like to be tamed. A pair of bronze bulls, proud and hollow, breathed fire taught by bad teachers. A furrow wished to be sown with dragon's teeth that would sprout opponents rather than harvest. It was a test designed to teach a foreigner what kind of land he had entered. Jason listened and did not interrupt. He had travelled far enough to know that even unreasonable requests are often history in disguise. Night collected itself, and with it came a presence that did not belong to the court, but knew how to walk in any corridor without being questioned. Medea's gaze was steady, the way a lamplight is steady, not large, not loud, but unwilling to abandon a room while it is still needed. She had learned her arts in a school whose roof was the movement of her own attention. Some would later call her witch, some saviour, some mother, some murderer. History, when tired, likes single words for complicated rooms. He saw in her posture not trickery, but craft, the same patience he had seen in shipwrights and gardeners, and the women who keep households from collapsing into noise. She knew which herbs remember fire kindly, which knots trust their own closures, which words can persuade a fear to wait outside for an hour. If love arrived between them, it did so the way evening arrives in gardens, by degrees, with moths, and with the feeling that the day, though over, has not been wasted. She showed him how to ask the bulls to remember their first breath, and not the fire they had been taught. She taught his skin to wear a balm that would ask flames to look elsewhere. She handed him a trick for dragon's teeth. Soldiers, a stone thrown where their eyes met, could convince them that their quarrel was with themselves. The tasks did not become easy, they became possible. He worked not as a hero in a song, but as a man who has decided that a promise is a thing worth sweat and small humiliations. And when the ground gave up its anger and the furrow held, he felt gratitude like water. The fleece itself hung in a grove where an old serpent coiled through centuries of duty. Its gold was not a shout, but a dawn caught and made portable. It shivered once, as if remembering a sheep's old warmth. Jason lifted it with care that looked like prayer. Then came the after choices, the kind that test a heart more than bulls do. Who leaves with whom? What heat follows such leaving? How the gods write in margins, even when mortals try to keep the page clean. Medea stepped onto Argo with the confidence of someone entering a room she has already imagined many times. The river held its breath, then remembered to be generous, and their wake began to write its long, complicated letter home. If there were betrayals, they did not wear their names yet. If there were costs to be paid far later, the purse was still closed. On the homeward water they learned the old lesson again, that the sea has two tempers, and neither is fully predictable. And they learned a new one, whispered in the night between two sleeping breaths, that victory is not the same as arrival. Between islands, Medea's counsel kept them whole. Between arguments, Jason's courtesy did the same. When they touched their own shore at last, friends and watchers braided into a crowd, and oaths were weighed beside results, as people always do, with scales that sometimes tilt toward what they wanted to believe all along. Songs sprang up, untrustworthy by their nature and yet necessary, because humans need their memories domesticated before they can sleep. The fleece was hung where sunlight could teach it humility. Feasts rehearsed forgiveness. The oars, leaned against a wall, slept the sleep of tools done with the day. And yet there is always that quiet, and yet the sea did not forget them, and neither did the gods, who like to use noble promises as tinder for difficult fires. The long oath of the voyage would echo down corridors of other lives, a woman learning what she can and cannot carry for love, a man discovering that triumph and tenderness need different kinds of courage, a city remembering that strangers and saviours often share a face. In a distant hall far from this shoreline, a golden fruit would roll where it should not, trailing a thread of envy finer than any rope. Three goddesses would look at the same shine and name three different reasons to own it. A shepherd prince would be asked to choose among impossible luxuries, and a single name spoken on a winded hillside would begin to move ships the way moon moves tide. In the last light, Argo's prow kept staring east, as if she could already see a harbour walled in high stone, a shore dark with oars, and a city where the night would one day turn the colour of a burning poem. The apple did not look like a weapon, only a warm coin of orchard light turning in a goddess's palm, a small sun grown on a tree that had learned to keep its sweetness even in divine company. And yet, when it rolled across the floor of a wedding where every guest believed themselves already blessed, the quiet of the room learned a new edge. It said, "For the fairest," a phrase as harmless as dew, and in that dew the seeds of long weather hid. He could almost see it moving through the air of that hall, like a moth no one admits to chasing. Hera's gaze, steady as governance. Athena's, cool as a well of reason in summer. Aphrodite's, the warmth that persuades winter to soften. Each certainty reached for the gleam and met another certainty's hand. Later, bards would embroider the tale with grudges and laughter, but in the simple version, a question too elegant to be solved was sent down the mountain to a boy whose childhood had given him more sheep than speeches. Paris, whose name would become a hinge on which many lives would turn, stood in grass that did not know it was about to be mown. He watched the three figures arrive like weather-choosing shape. Gifts were humming inside their words. Hera promised a tightening of borders and full granaries, the kind of prosperity that feels like a hand steadying a jug. Athena promised victory without bloodily learning it first, a clarity of mind that could bind a city's stones into a poem of order. Aphrodite promised what had no counting, love that would arrive as if returning, a face at a window that would teach windows what they were for. He was young and a shepherd, and a human, he chose the promise that matched the pulse. On a different mountain, the old word afti might have suggested the seam that holds the world resents being tugged. In this meadow, it made no sound. The apple found its home like a coin dropped into a well. The ring of it went on longer than anyone wished. Helen, whose name, when whispered, would one day seem to rinse the mouth with light, lived already. Like a refrain the world could not stop humming. Men spoke of her the way sailors speak of a wind that has a history. Women saw beyond the gleam to the sigh of a life inspected too often. Poets kept sharpening their quills on her reflection and discovered to their confusion that mirrors do not bleed. She had grown under oaks that knew how to be generous with shade. She had learned the grammar of a palace, its rooms nested like clauses, its courtyards teaching corners to be patient. Suitors had come like seasons. An oath had been made to keep the choice she or her father would make from becoming a civil argument. Each prince promised to protect the marriage once settled, an agreement as neat as a seal on wax and as complicated as human vow beneath weather. When Paris arrived, the air around her shifted as it sometimes does before a first monsoon. Not violent, just sure. Some say the gods colluded. Some say hearts collude readily enough without drafts from Olympus. Some say she was stolen. Some that she walked with open eyes toward a door that had already learned her steps in dreams. Whatever version one carries to bed, the wake on the sea traced the same silver sentence. In Sparta, a husband's honour woke like a startled animal and called allies by the oath they had hoped would never be needed. In the Greek world, 1,000 small grudges remembered their names and asked for passage. In Troy, a city with good walls and a habit of watching the horizon as a friend rather than an enemy, lamps were trimmed a little earlier than usual. Ships multiplied as if moonlight had learned to be wood. The old motifs returned to take attendance. The hearth's square became the order of decks. Pillars of council became musters where kings let captains speak. Nalanda's attentive lamp became a star caught at the tip of a mast. The garden's measured water became rationed casks that taught thirst to mind itself. The thread from a girl's careful hand in Crete became rigging that held when weather asked hard questions. An old man on a beach tested the tautness of one rope and knew by touch how many lives it could carry. A boy, too young to row, but old enough to fetch and learn, traced with the finger the shape of the coastline on a shield, memorizing the angles where the wind shifts its advice. Agamemnon practiced the heavy walk of a leader whose steps are heard twice, once by his men, once by the gods. Menelaus wore injury like a minimalist cloak. Odysseus, who loved home so intensely, the world had to keep providing detours to teach him what home means, tried to hide insanity, disguised as madness, and failed to convince his own cunning. Nestor's voice carried a patina of justice, learned from living long enough to regret without bitterness. Bees rehearsed on the gunnels. Gulls wrote apostrophes in air. Oars laid their syllables into the sea until a sentence formed that could not be paraphrased. Troy's first answer was not scorn but curiosity. The city had learned over centuries to be at once market and fortress, the way a wise person learns to be open without letting their heart be a doormat, and its towers wore watchfulness without frowning. Priam walked the walls with the compassion of a man who understands that the young often inherit fires the old failed to put out. Hecuba moved through rooms as if moving through a prayer, blessing and warning braided in her glance. Cassandra, poor truth-teller whose gift had been salted by a god's pettiness until no one could swallow it, spoke of flames, while the lamps were still kind, and people, being people, nodded and returned to their lists. Hector, whose nobility was woven from duty, the way a monk's robe is woven from patience, laid hand on horse and felt the animal remind him that speed can be gentle until it cannot. Paris, whose meadow choice had become a city choice, learned to stand in a doorway and hold both joy and consequence in the same breath without dropping either for a heartbeat. Helen walked the ramparts like a late summer breeze that does not yet admit to autumn. The old women of Troy, practical and tender, watched her with a sympathy capable of holding two contradictory opinions and still offering bread. The gods, interested as always in the theatre of their protégés, arranged their seating in clouds and rehearsed interventions that would satisfy no one for long. The march to Ilion did not look like a single march. It looked like many small departures that happened to rhyme. On beaches, fathers taught sons to lash fear to work. In inland orchards, wives pressed oil as if bottling the day's remaining peace. In sanctuaries, priests lifted knives reluctant as doves. Old stories say a wind demanded a life so that other lives might sail. And though scholars argue over versions, the ache of barter hangs palpable over the tale like smoke that refuses to leave a rafter's memory. When the fleet moved at last, horizon to horizon, like a new metal drawn into wire, the world's breath seemed to pause, not from admiration but from recognition. Something old in human story was turning its wheel again, the wish to retrieve, the need to punish, the hope that order might be restored by the very disorder that breaks it. At night, on the long water, those who would be enemies one day watched the same constellations measure the hours and learned the same discipline of not squandering a good wind. The sea practiced impartiality with the fairness of a scale that has no interest in either pan. He felt the earlier ages gather in the wake, all their lessons offered and all their warnings modestly ignored, the hearth telling of offering rather than appetite, the pillar requesting mercy, masquerading as law, the monastery suggesting that attention is a stronger wall than brick, the harbour reminding that trade knits where war unthreads, the temple asking for proportion as if beauty were also strategy, the tale advising that threads can lead you out of hungers that call themselves fate, but the oars had chosen their metre and the bows knit white stitches into the blue. Troy's plain spread itself like a table, about to host arguments with armour for cutlery. A river rehearsed how to explain to the dead that water still moves the same as before. In the Greek camp, a man would soon test a new shield and find that it held not only bronze, but a worldview. In the Trojan city, a mother would fold a small shirt and whisper to it as if it was skin. Between them, a pair of friends would discover how one shade of loyalty can make even gods defer their decree for an hour. The fleet approached like a moonrise that had learned to carry wood. The shore, unflinching, offered sand enough to record many feet, and in a tent that had not yet felt the weight of grief, a young warrior cleaned a spear the way a musician tunes a lyre, not knowing that music and weapon would soon learn each other's grammar, while somewhere a gentle wind, unable to keep counsel, wandered through the camp, whispering two names that would one day be spoken together as if they were one breath. Dawn had not yet chosen a colour when he woke to the grammar of the camp, the tin breath of kettles, leather learning the day's shape on shoulders, the sea's old sentence completed and begun again. And in that half-light, Achilles sat like a man listening to the tide inside his chest. Rage had been his weather for so long that calm felt like a strange visitor, unsure of where to place its hands. Patroclus moved through the tent with a gentleness that did not announce itself. He had learned how to tidy the distances between things, how to put the cup where the hand will want it, how to let silence become a bridge rather than a moat. Outside, dust rehearsed its small dance. Nearby, a boy lifted a lyre and found two notes that made the morning remember it could be kind. Scholars will go on arguing with immaculate courtesy about what bound these two. Cousins in some tellings, companions in others, the halves of a single courage, the tender intelligence that teaches a warrior where to end. Yet the felt truth is simpler. One kept, the other human, and the favour was mutual. When the quarrel with the High King had turned Achilles into a shoreline refusing the fleet, Patroclus had sat with him like a lamp that does not speak but refuses to go out. The ships were wood and oar and oath, the tents were rope and breath and bargaining. Honour, in that place, was a cloth everyone touched and few could name. He saw how it frayed under greed and tightened under grief. On the day the plain of Troy decided it had heard enough boasts not matched by action, Patroclus begged the armour from its sulking fame, as if asking a star to borrow its brightness for a while, so that fear might be persuaded to blink. Achilles, who loved him more than he loved his own image, polished by glory's hands, consented. The bronze learned a new gait on a different set of bones and did not protest. Hephaestus's work, hammered from divine temper, carried a world on its face, the fields, the harvests, the marriages that begin in shy laughter, the courts where elders practice remembering fairly, the lamb dance under the summer moon, the city at siege and the city at feast, so that the warrior who wore it could not pretend he fought for only one thing. If a shield can be a mirror, then honour must be willing to see itself in more than the opponent's eyes. Patroclus stepped into the light, and for a blessed hour the enemy thought the absent lion had returned. Men rallied to courage, the way scattered cattle run toward a bell. He drove the Trojans from the ships, flame-tasting canvas but not devouring, water relearning calm at the shore. He pursued farther than wisdom wanted. Glory, like a playful dog, pulled him past the edge of the yard. Hector met him where the wind keeps counsel, and the dust learned to hold its breath. The blow was clean. The armour's brightness could not keep a pulse from silence. When the helmet fell, it taught the world again how faces are tender. Grief has its own metre. Achilles heard it, and did not know at first which part of him had died. The camp's noises receded like a tide that had remembered an older shore. Men moved their mouths and made shapes called comfort, and the shapes broke like foam without reaching him. His hands learned ashes, an old language that remembers both hearth and rubble. The gods, who have a weakness for arranging human lessons at human cost, finally let a practical kindness through. Hephaestus, pitying what his earlier art had enabled, forged another set of armour, a second world on a second shield. The hammer's ring travelled through the night, like news of a birth delivered softly to those already asleep. In the bronze, a city married, a city argued, fields ripened, constellations kept their punctual mercy. On the rim, Oceanus circled like a blue sentence, holding the others in grammar. Achilles lifted it and saw himself as every man must see himself before harm, small inside a great order, powerful only as a careful hand is powerful, answerable to more than the weight of his own wrist. It did not cure him. It instructed him to carry his grief as if it were also a law. He went back to the plain with the steadiness that made time step aside. The river Scamander rose against him, because war had made it carry more truth than water should ever be asked to bear, and he wrestled with flood, the way a stubborn idea wrestles with a mind that wants quiet. Gods interfered, and were scolded and interfered again, their quarrels embroidered on the edges of human necessity. Hector waited. He had kissed a child's soft hair that morning, and knew how their little weight makes armour feel like a rumour. He had met his wife's eyes and promised nothing foolish. Between them, the two men carried enough nobility to teach death good manners, and yet death is an impatient student. When the spear found Hector, it felt both inevitable and wrong. The way sunset always feels fated, and yet startling. Achilles' rage, satisfied, discovered itself lonelier than before. Triumph approached him and could not find a place to sit. Even the Myrmidons, who had learned to hold their captain's temper like a shield, looked away when the chariot dragged dignity through dust. The gods disapproved, with the mild sarcasm reserved for human overreach, and a night later an old man walked into the tent like a lesson invented by mercy. Priam, with hands that had lifted sons as infants and as corpses, touched Achilles' fingers and turned the tent into a room where grief recognized itself in a foreign face. Bread was eaten that had no taste except the taste of being alive. Tears were exchanged as if they were coin that could spend in any city. From that hour, the shield's world pressed more quietly against Achilles' pulse. He understood that honour has a shape, and that shape changes when seen from a father's chair, from a widow's threshold, from the last bench where a scribe records who did not come back. Patroclus was given a funeral fit for a man who had borrowed a god's attention. Games were played with the strange seriousness humans reserve for play when they know that sorrow needs recess to remain bearable. The fire climbed and folded the body's story into smoke. Achilles stood by until even embers learned to be still. Somewhere a loom measured the warp for sailcloth. Somewhere a child learned to balance a cup. In the Greek camp, quiet took a breath before duty regained its footing. In Troy, women fetched water with more care for the slosh. The shield kept gleaming, a round reminder that the world continues while men make claims upon it with spears and promises. And beyond the plain, over patient water, there waited another rhythm. The oars and riddles of a man who would learn how to return by losing his way first. A map made of memory and desire that would have to be redrawn each dawn. The night laid its cool hand on bronze, the camp exhaled, and on a shore not far from sleep, a name rose with the surf and fell back, practicing how to be said. For 10 years without bitterness. 16. Night on the beach kept its breath as light as a sleeper, and in that kindly hush he watched the surf practice its old grammar, advance, bow, withdraw, while the masts drew faint, black calligraphy against a sky still salted with Troy's smoke. The name that had been rising and falling at the edge of the world finally stepped inland. Odysseus, whose cleverness was not a trickster's glitter so much as a carpenter's patience with joints that refuse at first to fit. He stood like a man whose home has been tugging on the invisible thread inside his ribs for too many seasons. The loom of Ithaca, olive wood, faithful hearth, the careful economy of island life, had kept weaving his absence into a cloth that warmed no one but refused to be thrown away. He knew boats and councils and the comedy of kings. He also knew the low consolations of bread and the way a child's drowsy question can put a torch into a room without setting anything on fire. The plain behind him still rehearsed its argument in ashes. The sea before him prepared its curriculum. Old motifs accompanied him like discreet friends. The hearth's ritual of offering became the discipline of ration and watch. The pillar's counsel thinned into the single voice in a storm that says, "Hold," when the body wants to spill. Nalanda's attention became a helmsman's night pupils. The temple square, where proportion makes space merciful, became the geometry of sail and spar. The thread a girl once let unspool in Crete became his own stubborn memory of a shoreline learned by heart. He spoke to his men the way a father speaks to an unruly hope, gently, with a leash long enough to let it tire itself without running into the dark. The first islands offered parables wearing masks. Among the lotus eaters, a sweetness so complete it erased the need to return came over the crew like fog. He walked from man to man and pressed the forgotten names of wives and children back into their mouths, as if returning coins they had dropped in sleep, then tied the dreamers to benches, not in cruelty, but in the old wisdom that sometimes ropes preserve dignity better than freedom does. In a cave, where hospitality failed its own test, a giant learned what eyes are for. The stake hissed in its green heat, and the smell of singed blindness rose, like an argument no one wanted to have. And out on the water, a clever false name, Nobody, floated between laughter and prayer. He taught the men to pull in time, the way he had once taught words to fit together. Even so, loss took its steady tithe. Aeolus's bag of winds, a portable weather kept by courtesy, opened at the wrong hour because impatience can dress itself as prudence if one is tired. The ship lurched back from almost home like a heart startled into arrhythmia. On Circe's island, a witch became a teacher by listening long enough to learn that a man can be restored by being named correctly. Swine found their faces. Seasons were negotiated with the goddess without anyone raising their voice. In the dim house of the dead, he sought counsel with a bravery that looked, from the outside, like despair trained to do a job. Mothers spoke, and comrades, and a prophet whose mouth tasted of clay and future, and he learned the unromantic truth that the sea can be crossed only by accepting how often it wants to keep what it takes. Sail by sail, story by patient splice, the journey continued. Sirens offered praise, sharpened into a hook. He heard the song bound upright to his mast, a man consenting to be warned by his own helplessness, while the crew's ears wore wax the way monks wear vows. Scylla took what the world had already priced into the road. Charybdis taught timing, that narrow mercy between too soon and too late. On the island of sun cattle, hunger argued with obedience and won, as it often does when fatigue mistakes itself for fate. The sky punished with a cold exactness gods prefer when they are tired of nuance. He survived alone on a piece of grammar, wood persuaded into clause and raft, until a shoreline with a kind queen received him the way temples receive rain. Songs there remembered his deeds with a generosity that can be as dangerous as malice if taken neat. He wept the way a man weeps when his own name, cleaned and warmed by a stranger's mouth, returns to him almost believable. Gifts were loaded, farewells layered like leaves, and sleep carried him home, folded in its giant palm. Waking on Ithaca, without knowing Ithaca was under him, felt like one of the gods' smaller jokes, the kind that teaches humility without scolding pride. He learned the island again by touch, the way a blind man reads a beloved's face, olive trunk, stone wall, goat path, the exact creak of a well-rope old before his beard learned grey. Disguise became a moral, not a deception. In a hut where faithful poverty kept a better court than palaces often do, Eumaeus, the swineherd who understood stewardship as a form of prayer, fed a stranger who was not strange and practiced a hospitality that made the gods nod, as if witnessing their own rule obeyed without spectacle. A son stepped into his father's shadow and found it fit. The embrace, rehearsed in 1,000 sleepless nights, took sudden shape in a room that smelled of smoke and soup. Odysseus, who had once named himself Nobody, learned to be everybody for an hour, beggar, guest, harmless old man. so that when his name stood up in the hall, it would be standing to reason, not merely to anger. The bow arced like a sentence that keeps its claws for 10 unhurried years and then lets it fly. The test was less of strength than of remembering how to marry hand and intention. The string sang, and a line of insolent hunger found its punctuation. Justice came, not delicate, not pretty, but with a clarity that once again made the hearth a place safe for voices. Penelope, whose patience had been misread as passivity by all but the gods, brought the final motif to its chair. The marriage bed, rooted in living wood, refused to be moved by a rehearsed lyre, and thus proved itself and the man in one courtesy. Recognition happened not as thunder but as water finding a channel kept for it through dry months. Their names, spoken quietly, turned the room into a temple that required no priest. He walked the island and blessed it with the ordinary. Hands on trunks, eyes on terraces, feet remembering which stones tilt. The old dog's grave held a lesson Scylla had not, that faith too has teeth, and they bite time rather than throats. In the morning's domestic arithmetic, the count of jars, the grain's patient hush, he felt more kingly than in any council of bronze and banners. And yet the world, never fully content with closures mortals can accept, arranged one more hinge for his story, a last journey whispered by the dead, an oar carried inland until someone mistook it for a winnowing fan, a peace brokered with the god of earthquakes by telling him essentially that the sea's grammar had been learned. Home was not the end, but the instrument by which endings are made gentle. He slept at last under a roof that kept its promises, and the island breathed as if a nettle had been plucked from its heel. Far away, on another road entirely, a different traveller stood at a crossroads where 3 paths met. A riddle would soon ask a proud city whether it knew itself, and the answer, clever, correct, fatal, would send a king walking forward with eyes that had not yet learned how to see. The city had learned a brittle way of breathing. Thebes wore a fever that touched harvest and cradle alike, and in the light that should have made marble kindly, dust hovered like an argument that refused to resolve. He came out to meet it, not as a king tempted by trumpets, but as a careful listener at the threshold of a sick room. Oedipus, who had made his name in the clear grammar of cleverness, who once stood before a creature stitched of terror and question, and found the seam that unpicked her, now walked the colonnades with the lamp steadier than the torches around him. The old motifs walked beside him, quieter for the circumstance. The hearth's square became the council circle. The pillars' counsel turned into decrees that asked grief to bear a little longer. Nalanda's lamp, reborn as attention, took notes in his gaze. The thread once unspooled in Crete reappeared as inquiry, a line he promised to follow through the city's tangled rooms. One could say the Sphinx had been a rehearsal, and this was the play, or that riddles, like gods, demand tax in arrears. He stood among supplicants, their wrists perfumed with the bitter of crush leaves, and vowed to track the source, to speak with gods and men until the air itself learned to breathe properly again. In this vow a double prophecy stirred like a snake beneath warm stones. News from Delphi kept its habit of illuminating and obscuring at once. Find the blood whose stain is older than your reign. Rid the city of what it carries unknowingly. And with the ease of tragic grammar, a promise he made to others began to tighten around his own throat like a polite leash. If the Sphinx taught that questions can kill, Tiresias taught that answers can wound. The old seer came not as spectacle but as reluctance embodied, a man who had learned compassion the hard way and now tried to spare 2 people at once by talking in a twist. Oedipus, who had once been rescued by the sharpness of his tongue, now found that same tongue dangerous. Impatience drew its sword in words, and pride, that old general who pretends to be a secretary, took notes. Around them the city's fever gathered in thresholds, lapped at cooking pots, whispered to nurses. The chorus, those voices that are also the city's lungs, measured the hour with lines that sounded like incense and dust mixed in one breath. Scholars will argue, kindly and forever, whether knowledge or character drove the wheel here, whether prophecy corners a man, or whether a man chooses the very corridor where his fate happens to be waiting. But the lamp's felt truth was simpler. The line one follows outward to rescue a city can be the same line that leads inward to one's oldest rooms. Witnesses arrived. A shepherd who had carried a baby with instructions attached to its ankles as if its feet had needed reminders. A messenger who had seen a young man adopt a city the way one adopts a stray cloud. A queen who kept a steady house until her household history stood up and spoke its formal name. Jocasta, sensible, warm, exhausted by the gods' taste for riddles, tried to wrap the day in a blanket of practical mercy. We have lived well enough, leave the sky out of it. Yet memory is a pothole even careful feet can't always avoid. The crossroads, that neat geometry of choice drawn on dirt, stepped forward from the past and placed itself in the room like a witness with dust still on his tunic. Where three ways met, a temper and a wheel had once met too. A man had been struck, a staff had been more than punctuation. Oedipus heard the line tighten through hours, places, names, until even denial, so agile when fed, could not find footing. To know is to touch heat. He reached for the fact, and it burned him clean. The mask of kingship, so useful for calming rooms, fell, and the face behind it recognized itself with the loneliness only recognition can deliver. If the Sphinx had made a corpse of a question, this knowledge made a question of a life. Who am I if the nouns that hold me blur? Jocasta, who had braided decades of tenderness into a city's days, took the shortest path out of a house gone suddenly windowless. He stumbled into a chamber where eyes that had served so loyally began to feel like uninvited guests. He did not punish sight, he converted it, making darkness an instrument for a new kind of knowing. The pins, small, domestic, patient, became fate's tools, not of cruelty, but of insistence. And the king, who had once answered a monster at the gate, now answered a different monster at the mirror. The chorus learned a softer meter. Pity and fear took seats like cousins who haven't spoken in years, and found, to their surprise, a shared vocabulary. Laws did not shrug. Thebes could not afford the luxury of treating consequences as metaphors, but the law's mouth did not snarl either. It spoke as a necessary reign speaks, briefly, without theatre. Oedipus argued for the hardest sentence, and then accepted a compromise that felt like justice, thinking about mercy, exile that ancient teacher. He touched his daughters, small anchors in rough water, and spoke to them as one speaks to birds before opening the cage. Remember the gentlest story of your home. It will outlive this season's bitterness. Antigone learned her father's hand by the pattern of its trembling more than by sight. Ismene learned that loyalty sometimes moves by staying rather than following. The gates of Thebes, which had admitted him once as a rescuer, learned the courtesy of letting him leave without spectacle. The city inhaled, then remembered how. On the road, the world practiced quiet around him. He felt trees the way a blind man reads a prayer on bark. He named streams by temperature, an ankle memory. He took instruction from the courtesy of strangers who had not heard his story, and therefore offered, untainted by gossip, the decency all stories ask at their beginning. Over time, the heat of knowledge cooled into something like wisdom, that cleverness is a candle, bright and local, while mercy is a moon, that riddles answered narrowly can sit like thorns in the fat of a life, that a city's health can be purchased at the price of a single house's ruin and still leave the buyer poorer than before. In Colonus, under the soft shade of sacred groves, where even crows bargained their noise down to a whisper, he found a kind of listening that did not need eyes. The earth accepted him as if he were a letter finally addressed correctly. Thunder made an appointment and kept it. Daughters learned the grammar of farewell. Some tellings make his end a vanishing, as if the land itself, having fed on so many footsteps, wished to keep one as a token. Others make it a simple death, its simplicity the most radical mercy the gods ever grant. Either way, the seam between world and word held, and the city he had harmed by accident gained a blessing by intention. Thebes chastened breathed. Athens, instructed by a guest it had not asked for, added one more lesson to the civics of kindness. The chorus, always the city's lungs, exhaled with gratitude, kept quiet by awe. He had answered one riddle too well, and another not at all. The cost of clever questions lay not in the asking, but in the forgetfulness of the asker, forgetting that answers must be carried like water, not brandished like swords. Night gathered his story into its shawl and turned its face toward another edge of the world, where a different kind of knowledge was learning to walk on strings and silence. Somewhere, in a thicket of laurel and shadow, a lyre was being tuned to the pitch of the under-earth. A man who trusted music more than argument would soon test whether love could persuade stone to behave like a listening thing. The path to that door was already soft with the footfalls of grief. The river below the roots rehearsed how to remember names in darkness, and on the surface, where mortals still trimmed lamps and braided hair before sleep, a single note rose like a moth and hovered, refusing to decide between earth and the long, patient road beneath it. He tuned the lyre the way one tunes a room to gentleness, testing each string until the air remembered how to listen. Orpheus had learned that music is not a melody imposed, but a conversation coaxed from silence, and on the morning grief burned clear enough to name, he carried that conversation toward a door the living are not meant to open. Eurydice's absence sat beside him like a second shadow, no scolding, only the soft insistence of an unfinished sentence, and the path to the under-earth received his feet with a courtesy as old as dust. He walked through groves where laurel let its fragrance teach the hour, through gullies where water kept the memory of its own fall, and at each turn the lyre told stones to be patient, and stones obeyed. The old motifs accompanied him like discreet companions. The hearth's tenderness returned as the small warmth under his hand where wood had learned to sing. The pillar's counsel became a vow to carry love without demanding witness. The square of temples and gardens became his steady gait. Proportioned, unhurried, Nalanda's lamp became the attention he granted each step, so no pebble would be asked to bear more story than it could. At the hillside slit that opens into myth, he greeted the threshold as one greets an elder, without argument, with measured breath, and sound, which had been a world above, became a torch below. The gatekeeper dog, bred to recognize necessity, let his 3 heads lean into the rhythm until their vigilance slept. Shades paused in their pale errands. Even the river that taxes every crossing rounded its shoulders into mercy, allowing awe and current to rhyme for once without quarrel. It is said that the rulers of that kingdom do not smile easily. Yet, when the song reached the room where verdicts keep their posture, Something in the Queen's long patience warmed, and the King, who understands debt better than calendars, allowed a rule to bend without breaking. The condition was a single thread knotted to an old human weakness. Trust must not look back to check itself. He bowed, not as a performer, but as a man who has been granted a loan he knows he cannot repay except by tenderness. They set out, his feet memorizing the slope by touch, her steps following, as if his music were a rope unspooling through darkness with the reliability of breath. She said nothing because the realm he was leaving forbids such currencies. But he felt her nearness, the way a hand feels the gravity of another hand a moment before it lands. The mind, which had behaved itself during the bargaining by hiding behind song, now came forward with its catalogues. What if the gods changed their minds, as gods sometimes do? What if the last stair twisted into a corridor that erased footsteps? What if silence were not obedience but emptiness? The lyre kept the beat, like a heart remembering its task. He squared his shoulders, the way a sailor squares a sail against a reasonable wind. The path climbed. Scholars will argue with the tact of friends about why one glance was forbidden. Not because love must be blind, but because love, to remain itself, must sometimes accept evidence it cannot weigh. Others will say the prohibition was a kindness. No shock of her incomplete skin at the seam where worlds disagree. Still others will make of it a parable that warns against artistry trusting itself more than its vow. He felt only the burn of a small doubt slipping its leash. Near the mouth of day, where a thread of sun fell like a blessing learning to speak again, he turned. Not the theatrical turn of suspicion, not the impatient turn of pride, but a human turning, quick and tiny, the body checking what the spirit had been told to believe. In that moment, the law held, as even tender laws must, and her outline, which had kept pace like a promise, released itself back into the gentler night with the courtesy of a wave withdrawing from sand. The air tasted of unripe thunder. The lyre forgot its grammar and made a single low sound. He stood for a long time without insisting on the hour, learning how grief, when struck twice in the same place, darkens but does not go dumb. Some versions say he sat at the threshold until Moss knew his name, some that he travelled desert after desert trying keys that fit no lock, some that he sang the secret of sorrow to trees until their rings began recording a new weather. In all of them, he refused the consolation of anger, preferring the clean ache that tells you love has simply changed address. The world hearing adjusted itself around his sound. Birds edited their morning songs to include a bar of his humility. Rivers calmed their middle voices. Even the wind, usually a critic, carried his phrase unaltered over hills. Women listened hardest, some out of compassion, some because they recognized in his refusal to harden a strength they wished the world would learn. Men listened too, sometimes awkwardly, like students asked to practice a kindness that feels at first like losing. The old motifs came to sit with him again. He remembered the pillar's lesson. That authority, if it is to keep, must kneel before mercy. He remembered the garden's rule, that order is only beautiful when it soothes. He remembered the thread at Crete, that the way out is made by faithful repetition, not by not. Perhaps the second look had been inevitable, perhaps it had been avoidable. Either way, the song now knew the seam between need and trust, and he learned to place his fingers there without reopening it. In time, the story frays, as stories do near their borders. Some say the world, tired of being improved by sadness, turned his audience into stones. Some that the Maenads, exasperated by his loyalty to a single absence, tore the musicians into pieces night could distribute among waters, some that his head, still singing, floated to a shore where an oracle grew from the place its voice elects to rest. He would not have wished spectacle, he would have preferred one suspects to end like a well-played chord, resolved but echoing. Yet even in the harsher endings a tenderness survives. The lyre recovered, taught new hands, the discipline of matching breath to truth. His notes learned to live in instruments not yet unborn. The paths he walked toward patience became roads for other feet. Lovers, when tempted to measure devotion by anxiety, remember his glance and are kinder to themselves. Mourners, when asked to balance memory and faith, borrow his posture and decline to be hurried. And somewhere between harvest and snowfall, in the valley where torches teach grain fields to glow without burning, women gather with men who trust them, and words become less important than the way bread is shared. The air there wears a hush strong enough to carry initiates through a winter without lying about death. An old goddess of grain learns to play the host. A younger one who knows both downward and return sets an extra place. On another hill, a stone mouth listens for the correct question. Laurel leans in. A spring rehearses how to speak in riddles that heal rather than harm. The music that failed to steal back a life finds other uses, teaching cities to grieve without cruelty, teaching pilgrims to walk more softly. And when night gathers its shawl along the road to the sanctuary, a faint tune, no more than a thread, winds among the olive trunks, guiding strangers toward a distant colonnade, where torches, like patient stars, wait to be lifted, one by one. The road turned softer underfoot, as if the earth itself wished for quiet, and before the columns he felt the air practice stillness, the way a chest practices breath before prayer. Temples that seemed to be built of pauses as much as stone, their shadows laid with the care of a hand smoothing a child's hair. He washed at the basin where water remembered pilgrims, and the old motifs arrived to keep him company. The hearth's giving, now a small lamp cupped in olive oil. The pillar's counsel, now an axis about which waiting could revolve. The garden's measured water, now a spring teaching minds to cool before they listened. At Eleusis, the road narrowed into secrecy without becoming cruel. Torches stitched night to night across the Rarian plain, and even the dust learned to step softly as those who had fasted moved toward a door that talk could not follow. They said little, as all good rehearsals of wonder require, only that an old grief about grain and loss had been taught to ripen into compassion, that a mother's winter could lend its strength to strangers without asking their names, that the seed's silence was not death but a sturdy grammar beneath appearances. Scholars, patient and sincere, would go on debating the recipe of that hush, whether barley and mint hid a sacrament, whether theatre and rite braided into a kindness the heart could remember when fields went lean, whether the things said and things shown were ancient intimacies or perfected surprises. But inside the sanctuary, the felt truth was simpler. Humans learned to descend without panic and to rise without pride. And the torches, raised at the right hour, made even the ordinary face look newly worth protecting. Leaving, he noticed how footsteps kept the cadence of harvest rather than battle. A vow to be gentler with bread went ahead of him, like a candle deciding where the dark would end. The road climbed to where Laurel leaned in to listen, and Delphi received him with a hush that had the texture of hammered gold. The cliffs held their red like a carefully kept fever, and the Castalian spring, obedient as a good sentence, rinsed away the unnecessary noise. In the precinct, a stone navel sat with the modesty of a centre that does not need to boast, and treasuries from many cities, Small stone pride boxes stood like polite rivals who have learned to lower their voices in a library. He watched the tripod claim its corner of air, the priestess seated as if the mountain's patience had borrowed a woman's body to speak. Vapour or no vapour, scholars will argue gently forever about chasm and gases, about Laurel's mild intoxication, or the sober arithmetic of trance. The room arranged itself to receive ambiguity with dignity. Questions came with sacrifices on their breath, answers learned to be couplets that refused to humiliate either future or petitioner. A king wanting to begin learned the kinder danger of waiting. A city tempted to expand learned that borders can be courtesies, not only fences. A lover discovered that a name spoken softly in spring will still require courage in winter. He heard how the oracle's riddles did not hide knowledge so much as insist on co-ownership. Mortals must carry their share of interpretation, gods their share of restraint. Between utterance and act lay a small necessary winter, the time in which a plan learns humility. Laurel leaves clicked like quiet applause. The old motifs nodded to one another. The thread from Crete, now philosophical, find your way by attention rather than appetite. The pillar from the plain, now musical. Power should lower its voice to be understood. The monastery's lamp, translated, think carefully, then be kind. Dodona was older in voice and simpler in furniture. Oaks that had learned to speak by listening to their own leaves. Bronze vessels colliding like weather taught to spell. Doves whose presence the priests borrowed as letters. Here Zeus did not thunder so much as murmur, and the answers felt like villages advising cities. Far to the south and east, in Asclepius's precinct at Epidaurus, healing chose an instrument closer to sleep than decree. He lay one night on the cool stone of the Abaton and joined that long grammar of the suppliant. Incubation, they called it. As if health were an egg the mind must warm without cracking. Serpents glided with the indifference of old symbols. Dogs padded with the pragmatism of orderlies, and a dream, neither gaudy nor trivial, taught the body how to inch back toward equilibrium. In morning light the porticos glowed with little clay thank yous. Feet that had stopped hurting, hands that had learned again the exactness of cups, eyes that had remembered the horizon. The terracotta limbs crowded the walls like a modest census of mercy. He saw how medicine here did not need to quarrel with prayer, how regimen and reverence could share a table without pushing the bread aside. A physician traced a diet in dust with a stick, while a priest tied a ribbon around a child's wrist, and no one felt the world split. At crossroads, where shrines to Hecate kept lamps where roads debated their next sentence, he found a different counsel, the kindness of thresholds. Travellers left a little oil, a little bread. The knight, reassured, let the fox keep his appointment, and the lost find a softer kind of fear. Hermes, never far from a stone heap or a witty signpost, taught the feet to trust their corrections. A pile of pebbles acquired the gravity of a chorus. He thought how temples disciplined the air into gentleness, not to hoard it, but to teach it a habit it could carry back into streets. How oracles refused to insult a question by answering it too quickly. How mystery rites took a hold of grief and baked it into something travellers could pack for a winter of doubt. The more he went, the less he wanted spectacle, and the more he wanted rooms where silence and courage shake hands. Even markets seemed to have learned from the precincts. Voices lowered without losing cheer. Measures were checked with a trace of ceremony. A stranger's accent was allowed to finish its sentence before prices were named. He carried the roads home in his pockets like smooth stones. At a village hearth, he saw the same architecture in miniature. A square of warmth proportioned to a family's needs, a shelf with a lamp that asked more oil of the day's labour, but repaid with steadier evenings. A little niche where a figure, god, ancestor, weather, watched without demanding. The distinction between sacred and ordinary thinned to a seam one could cross with clean hands and a decent intention. He slept one night by a field where barley nodded its plain amen to the stars, and the wind brought from somewhere beyond the last hill a rumour of marble learning to think in new ways. Stowers where talk would be treated like a shared bread, schools where questions would be admitted without sacrifice, a city that would try to organise its courage not only around altars but around ideas. He did not rise to chase the rumour. He turned on his side and let the night finish its patient sentence. In the east, the thinnest grey braided itself with a thread of blue. A single bell somewhere asked morning to be gentle. A swallow stitched roofline to roofline with the old confident curve. And on a hill that had not yet spoken its full name, stone began to imagine balance so exact it could teach nations how to stand, while far below, in an alley where olive leaves kept, save to their soft applause, a child cupped a flame from an elder's lamp and walked carefully toward a door, just beginning to remember the shape of light. The hill learned its name slowly, as if stone preferred to earn speech by holding still, and in that patience a city practiced a new kind of courage, not the shout of a charge, but the measured breath of minds agreeing to test themselves in daylight. He climbed at dawn, when marble was the colour of unspooled milk, and the columns, fluted like the ribs of a great sleeping creature, took the sun in increments, each groove a thin sip of fire. Balance stood there, as if it had grown from rock, entablature resting on capitals with the ease of a cup in a careful hand. Around him, the air wore chalk on its sleeves. A mason tapped once and listened the way a physician listens to a chest. A sculptor's chisel ticked like a small clock that believed in eternity. A woman with a basket of figs placed them as tidily as arguments on a table where friends had promised to be fair. The old companions gathered without fuss. The hearth square arrived as the geometry of platforms and steps, a generosity of proportion that taught crowds how to enter awe without losing their balance. The pillars' council stood literal and figurative, stone lesson and civic advice in one body, reminding assemblies below that strength can feel like listening when it is well carried. Nalanda's lamp flickered inside syllogisms. Attention became a city's vocation, questions no longer needing a god's disguise to be admitted. The temple's calm taught the eye its mercy, its refusal to bully. The garden's measured water returned as measured speech, taxis, logos, the placement of words so that they soothed without sleeping. In the theatre, carved from the slope like a shell to catch human voices, choruses rehearsed the weather of pity and fear. In the stoa, shade expanded into ethics. In the gymnasium, breath learned responsibility to thought. The world that had once listened for oracles now learned to become one another's oracle with restraint. Laws were written not to bind the ankle, but to tie the city to its better self. Votes fell like quiet rain. Even dissent learned a courteous posture, a hand lifted palm up instead of a fist. And yet the altar smoke still rose, piety and reason sitting like old friends on a bench, passing the cup, unconcerned with argument, because both had been taught a common modesty by sea and season. He walked the streets where tradesmen spoke with the pride of things that last, potters who had learned the patience of the wheel, weavers who knew how to talk a pattern into cloth, shipwrights who heard the sea and timber the way a listener hears a friend in a crowd. A child with dust on her knees recited a fragment about measure and harmony, then tripped, laughed, and kept the line anyway. a teacher corrected with the gentleness that made memory wish to return. At noon, the shrines held their shadows like cups of cool water. At market, olives lay in bowls like small dark moons. Somewhere a philosopher compared virtue to a road that grows straighter as you become honest enough to notice its curves. He recognised how the thread from the Cretan girl had become an instruction for civic life. Tie decisions to first principles, then walk, slowly, accountable, to the end and back again. He felt how the pillars of an old king, teaching mercy in stone, had travelled into the discipline of argument that refuses to humiliate an opponent. How the harbour's monsoon grammar had turned into treaties that prefer seasons to appetite. How the saints' soft thunder had stayed in the voice of a poet who could persuade a city that kindness is cheaper than rage. Even the wars the city would not escape carried traces of a better intention, as if the age itself were learning that victory without a future is merely an expensive way to rename loss. Marble cracked in earthquakes and was repaired, debates fractured and were mended. Exile, that old teacher, did his rounds. And still, on most mornings, bread was broken in peace, and mothers taught children which stars are trustworthy. Toward evening, as the light withdrew into a colour that made lions on coins look almost tender, he stood where the hill meets sky and let the long river of the series he had walked unspool behind his eyes. He saw again the first fire by a river whose name remembers hymns, the square in ash that taught hands how to offer rather than demand, the pillar speaking law in a voice softened by grief, the brick libraries where wind turned pages, the harbour with sails like measured prayers, the temple whose charged stillness taught towers to be humble, the court where elegance and frontier shook hands, the well where animals learned the grammar of choice, the shrine where longing braided breath, the courtyard where names circled a centre without a face, the garden where water braided mercy into geometry, the palace where a girl's thread remembered the way back from horror, the ship that learned oath and weather at once, the shore where an apple became a hinge, the plain where a shield carried a world, and two names learned the grammar of friendship, the long homecoming where a bow sang and a bed, rooted in living wood, told truth, the city that learned the cost of cleverness, the lyre that asked stone to be kind and taught the living how to bear the answer, the sanctuaries where grief was made portable and counsel learned ambiguity's courtesy. And now this hill, teaching balance, as if balance were a prayer the body could say without words. He felt how each age had practiced one kindness and handed it forward. Fire's patience to pillar, pillar's mercy to library, library's attention to sail, sail's season to temple, temple's proportion to court, court's poise to story, story's net to song, song's surrender to garden, garden's measure to law, until the chain felt less like progress than like remembering. Night came without drama, as if granting him a last ritual of quiet. Lamps bloomed in doorways like small local stars. Somewhere a mother sang a scale that had once steadied oars. Somewhere a mason laid down his tools with the neatness of a man who respects tomorrow. Somewhere a widow trimmed a wick and let the flame teach the room a smaller, dearer courage. He understood then that history is not the parade of conquerors, but the custody of breath, the way one generation teaches another how to set a cup down without noise, how to speak with strength that does not bruise, how to bind a wound with cloth that was meant for celebration, and not resent the change in purpose. The city loosened its belts of marble and slept. The hill kept its vigil with the serene indifference of a teacher who trusts the lesson has landed, And he, carrying the long braid of fires and waters, stones and songs, leaned on the rail of evening and let gratitude spread through him like warm ink. Thank you, he thought, not to gods in particular, not to men alone, but to the patient seam that lets world and word hold together. Beyond the roofs, the sea rehearsed its old, soft grammar. Above the columns, a first shy star practiced being seen. Somewhere, in a house that would never be famous, a child turned in sleep and found a calmer dream. And far away, on a road that leaves our story and enters yours, a traveller lifted a lamp with borrowed flame and kept walking, slowly, kindly, into the listening dark.